In 1952, archaeologists discovered something that would shatter every assumption about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Among nearly 1,000 ancient manuscripts written on parchment and papyrus, there was one that stood completely apart. It wasn't made of animal skin. It wasn't written on fragile paper. Instead, it was hammered into solid copper, a metal so valuable in ancient times that using it for writing was almost unthinkable. And when scholars finally managed to unroll this mysterious artifact, they found something even more shocking. This wasn't a religious text. It wasn't a prayer or a prophecy. It was a treasure map, listing 64 locations where massive amounts of gold and silver were supposedly hidden. The question that has haunted researchers for over 70 years is simple yet terrifying. Was this map real? Or was it the greatest hoax in archaeological history? The story begins in Cave 3 at Qumran, near the Dead Sea, where Bedouin shepherds and archaeologists had been finding ancient scrolls since 1947. By 1952, they had discovered hundreds of manuscripts, all following the same pattern. They were religious texts, biblical commentaries, community rules, hymns and prayers from a Jewish sect called the Essenes. Every single scroll told stories of faith, of God, of spiritual devotion. But then came the discovery that changed everything. At the back of Cave 3, hidden in debris and dust, lay 2 rolled pieces of oxidized copper. They were heavy, corroded, and completely unlike anything found before. The metal had turned green with age, brittle and dangerous to touch. No one had ever seen a Dead Sea Scroll made of metal. The implications were immediate and unsettling. Someone in ancient times had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve this particular message, choosing the most expensive and permanent medium available. The physical properties of the copper scroll were remarkable in themselves. When fully assembled, it measured 8 feet long, 1 foot wide, and weighed over 20 pounds. The copper sheets were less than 1 millimeter thick, hammered and shaped with incredible precision. The text was not written with ink, but punched into the metal from the back, creating raised letters on the front surface. This technique required specialized tools and considerable skill. Whoever created this scroll invested enormous resources, both in materials and labor. Copper was expensive in the ancient world, far more valuable than parchment or papyrus. Using it for writing was like printing a book today on sheets of gold. The message contained on this copper had to be worth protecting at any cost, worth preserving for millennia, worth ensuring that neither fire nor water nor time itself could destroy it. But there was a problem. The scroll had oxidized so severely over 2,000 years that it couldn't be unrolled without crumbling into fragments. For 4 years, it sat in a museum, untouchable and unreadable, while experts debated how to open it without destroying it. Finally, in 1955, Professor H. Wright Baker at the University of Manchester devised a solution. He built a special saw that could cut through the brittle copper like slicing a loaf of bread. Over several months, the scroll was carefully cut into 23 segments. Each cut revealed more text, and with each revelation, the excitement in the archaeological community grew. When the full text was finally exposed and photographed, scholars faced a document unlike any they had encountered. The language was Hebrew, but a peculiar dialect filled with Greek loanwords and local terminology. And the content was not spiritual. It was purely, shockingly material. The scroll began with a simple statement. In the ruin that is in the valley of Achor, under the steps which go eastward 40 cubits, a chest of silver and its vessels, weighing 17 talents. Then another location. In the monument which is in the second platform, 900 talents. And another, in the great cistern which is in the courtyard of the small colonnade, sealed in the wall opposite the upper door, 900 talents. Line after line, the text continued with mathematical precision, listing location after location, each containing staggering amounts of precious metals. The descriptions included measurements in cubits, references to architectural features, mentions of tombs and cisterns and hidden chambers. This was not poetry or prophecy. It was a detailed inventory, a systematic record of hidden wealth scattered across the Judean landscape. The quantities mentioned in the scroll were almost impossible to comprehend. Scholars calculated that if all 64 locations were real, the total treasure would amount to approximately 26 tons of gold and 65 tons of silver. To put this in perspective, that's more precious metal than was held in the treasury of most ancient kingdoms. In modern terms, we're talking about billions of dollars worth of gold and silver, hidden in caves and cisterns and underground chambers around Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. No individual could have amassed such wealth. Even a wealthy temple would struggle to accumulate such reserves. The sheer scale suggested something unprecedented, perhaps the entire treasury of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, or the combined wealth of the Essene community collected over generations, or possibly something else entirely that historians had never considered. What made the copper scroll even more intriguing was its final line. In the pit adjoining on the north, in a hole opening northwards and buried at its mouth, a copy of this document, with an explanation and their measurements and an inventory of each thing and other things. This tantalizing reference suggested that somewhere there was another scroll, perhaps also made of copper, that provided the key to understanding the cryptic directions. It would explain the measurements, clarify the locations, provide context for the entire treasure map. But despite 70 years of searching, this explanatory scroll has never been found. Was it destroyed? Was it discovered by the Romans and melted down for the metal? Or is it still buried somewhere, waiting to reveal the truth behind the greatest treasure mystery in archaeological history? The immediate reaction from the academic community was divided and heated. Some scholars, led by Father Roland Deveau, who supervised the Qumran excavations, dismissed the scroll as fantasy or folklore. They argued that the amounts were too large to be real, that the descriptions were too vague to be useful, and that the scroll might be a record of legendary treasures rather than actual buried wealth. After all, ancient Jewish texts contained many stories of hidden treasures, mythical accounts of riches spirited away before various catastrophes. Perhaps this was simply one community's compilation of such legends, written down and preserved because the stories themselves were valuable, not because the treasures were real. This interpretation allowed scholars to explain away the scroll without having to confront the uncomfortable possibility that vast wealth might actually be buried in places they couldn't access or search. But other researchers weren't convinced by the folklore theory. They pointed out crucial differences between the copper scroll and typical treasure legends. First, the scroll's language was dry and technical, lacking the narrative embellishments common in folklore. There were no stories, no heroes, no dramatic accounts of how the treasures came to be hidden, just locations and quantities recorded with bureaucratic precision. Second, the use of copper itself argued against the folklore interpretation. Why spend enormous resources to record myths? Legends were transmitted orally or written on cheap materials. The investment in copper suggested that someone believed these locations were real and needed to be preserved with absolute reliability. Third, the scroll's Hebrew contained specific technical terms and local place names that suggested first-hand knowledge of the Jerusalem area in the 1st century AD, not the vague geography typical of legendary accounts. The question of why someone would inscribe a treasure map on copper led to fascinating speculation. In ancient times, important documents were typically written on parchment or papyrus, materials that could be easily copied, transported, and stored. Copper was chosen only when permanence was absolutely essential, when the message needed to survive fire, flood, war, and the passage of centuries. This suggested that whoever created the scroll expected a long delay before the treasures would be recovered. They knew they might not survive to retrieve the wealth themselves. They understood that the political situation might remain dangerous for generations. So they created a record that would outlast any catastrophe, that would remain legible even if buried for millennia. The choice of copper was an act of desperate hope, a message thrown forward through time to unknown descendants who might one day be able to reclaim what was hidden. But this raises an even darker question. If the scroll was meant to help future generations recover the treasure, why were the directions so cryptic and difficult to follow? The locations mentioned architectural features that might no longer exist, used measurements that were ambiguous, referred to place names that have changed or been forgotten over 2 millennia. It's as if the creators wanted to preserve the information, but also wanted to ensure that only someone with specialized knowledge could use it. Perhaps they feared the scroll falling into enemy hands. Perhaps they intended it to be used in conjunction with oral traditions that have since been lost. Or perhaps they believed the explanatory scroll mentioned in the final line would provide the necessary context, never imagining that it would be lost while the copper scroll survived. The timing of the scroll's creation adds another layer to the mystery. Most scholars date it to around 70 AD, the year Roman legions under Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the Second Temple. This was a catastrophic moment in Jewish history when the entire social and religious structure of Jewish life was shattered. In the chaos of the siege, as Roman armies surrounded the city and starvation gripped the population, someone made the decision to hide enormous quantities of wealth and create an indestructible record of where it was hidden. The urgency of the situation is almost palpable. They didn't have time for elaborate explanations or clear directions. They had to work quickly, hiding treasure in accessible locations and recording just enough information that someone familiar with pre-war Jerusalem might be able to find it again. Imagine the scene! Jerusalem burning! Roman soldiers systematically looting the temple. Priests and rebels knowing that capture meant death or slavery. In those final desperate days, groups of men carrying heavy vessels filled with gold and silver, moving through tunnels and cisterns, burying the sacred and precious in hidden places. One group, perhaps the leadership of the Essene community at Qumran, taking on the responsibility of creating a record, gathering copper sheets, the most durable material they could find, punching letters into the metal by lamplight, listing location after location, knowing they might not survive but hoping someone in the future would. Rolling the completed scroll, placing it in Cave 3 with the other sacred texts, sealing it away, and then either dying in the war or being scattered so completely that no one ever returned to recover what they had hidden. The historical context makes the treasure theory compelling. The Second Temple was not just a religious building, but also served as the central bank of Jewish society. Pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world brought offerings and tithes. Wealthy families deposited valuables for safekeeping. The temple treasury held not just ceremonial objects, but also enormous reserves of gold and silver that backed the temple economy. When the Romans breached the walls, the priority for the priests would have been to save what they could. Ancient sources, including the Jewish historian Josephus, mention that some treasures were hidden before the final fall. But Josephus doesn't provide details about where or how much, leaving historians to wonder whether the copper scroll might be the missing piece of the puzzle, the actual inventory that Josephus knew existed but never saw. Yet 70 years of searching have yielded nothing. Expeditions have been mounted, locations have been excavated, theories have been tested and rejected. In 1960, British scholar John Allegro led the first systematic attempt to locate the treasures based on the scroll's directions. He excavated several sites around Qumran, following the copper text as closely as possible. He found ancient pottery, some evidence of habitation, but no treasure. The expedition was considered a failure, and Allegro's reputation suffered. Critics said the scroll was obviously fictitious, that Allegro had wasted time and money chasing a fantasy. But Allegro himself never lost faith. He insisted until his death that the scroll was genuine, that the problem was interpretation, not authenticity, that someone with better knowledge of first-century Jerusalem geography might succeed where he had failed. The fundamental problem with finding the copper scroll treasures is that the ancient landscape has changed almost beyond recognition. The destruction of 70 AD was so complete that even the Temple Mount was plowed under. 2,000 years of earthquakes, erosion, construction, and warfare have obliterated most architectural features mentioned in the scroll. When the text says, "Under the steps that go eastward," which steps does it mean? The temple had dozens of staircases. When it mentions the monument in the second platform, which monument and which platform? Jerusalem had multiple levels and terraces. Every direction in the scroll assumes the reader is familiar with the city as it existed in 70 AD, knowledge that has been almost completely lost. It's like giving someone directions to a house in a city that no longer exists, using street names that have changed, referencing buildings that were demolished centuries ago. Modern technology has provided new tools for treasure hunters. Ground-penetrating radar can detect voids and metal objects underground without excavation. Satellite imaging can reveal ancient structures buried under soil and vegetation. Computer analysis can cross-reference the scroll's place names with historical records and archaeological surveys. In 2007, an American researcher named Jim Barfield used these techniques to identify what he believed were 9 of the 64 locations mentioned in the Copper Scroll. He presented his findings to Israeli authorities and requested permission to excavate. His request was denied. The sites were in politically sensitive areas, some under Palestinian jurisdiction, some near religious sites, where excavation might cause international incidents. Barfield could see where he believed the treasures were, but he couldn't touch them. He had solved the mystery, he claimed, but couldn't prove it. This illustrates perhaps the greatest irony of the Copper Scroll. We might actually know where some of the treasures are hidden, but political, religious, and practical considerations make excavation impossible. Some locations are now under buildings, roads, or settlements. Others are in areas where digging would require displacing current inhabitants. Still others are near sites sacred to Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, where archaeological work could trigger religious or political conflicts. The treasures, if they exist, might remain buried not because we can't find them, but because we're not allowed to look. The ancient priests created a record that would last forever, but they couldn't have imagined the complex modern world where knowing and doing are separated by layers of politics, diplomacy, and competing claims to holy ground. The Copper Scroll's uniqueness among the Dead Sea Scrolls cannot be overstated. When archaeologists began discovering scrolls in the Qumran caves in 1947, they uncovered a library that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient Judaism. Cave after cave yielded manuscripts on parchment and papyrus, carefully preserved in clay jars, protected from the elements for nearly 2,000 years. These texts included the oldest known copies of biblical books, commentaries on scripture, hymns of thanksgiving, community regulations, and apocalyptic visions. Every single scroll, without exception, dealt with religious matters. They revealed the spiritual life of the Essenes, a Jewish sect that had withdrawn from mainstream society to live in purity and await divine intervention. The scrolls showed their beliefs, their practices, their hopes for the end times. And then came the Copper Scroll, breaking every pattern. Unlike its companion scrolls, the Copper Scroll contains no mention of God. There are no prayers, no psalms, no references to divine law or prophetic visions. The language is clinical and transactional, concerned entirely with the physical world. While other scrolls quote scripture and interpret ancient prophecies, the Copper Scroll lists measurements and locations with the precision of an accountant's ledger. While other scrolls are written in the elegant script of trained scribes, the Copper Scroll's letters are crudely punched into metal, functional rather than beautiful. The contrast is so stark that some scholars initially wondered if the scroll had somehow been misplaced, if it belonged to a completely different group or time period. But radiocarbon dating and paleographic analysis confirmed that it was contemporary with the other Qumran texts, created and hidden at the same time by people from the same community. The physical differences are equally dramatic. Every other Dead Sea Scroll was written with carbon-based ink on organic materials, parchment made from animal skins, or papyrus made from reeds. These materials were relatively inexpensive and readily available throughout the ancient Near East. A scribe could obtain parchment, prepare his inks, and write for hours, creating page after page of text at minimal cost. The copper scroll required an entirely different process and far greater resources. First, someone had to acquire thin sheets of nearly pure copper, a metal valuable enough to be used for coins and decorative objects. Then, they had to hammer the copper into uniform thickness, approximately 1 millimeter thin, flexible enough to be inscribed but strong enough not to tear. This alone required specialized metalworking skills and considerable time. The copper had to be carefully prepared, its surface smoothed and cleaned. The inscription technique was unlike any other ancient writing method. Instead of using ink or engraving from the front, the scribe punched the letters through from the back of the copper sheet. This created raised letters on the front surface, similar to embossing but done entirely by hand. Each letter required multiple strikes with a small punch or stylus, carefully controlled to create legible characters without tearing through the thin metal. The process was slow, laborious, and unforgiving. Mistakes couldn't be easily erased or corrected. The scribe had to work with absolute precision, letter by letter, line by line, until the entire text was complete. Modern experiments attempting to recreate this technique have shown just how difficult it was. Even experienced metalworkers struggle to punch clear, consistent letters into thin copper. The ancient scribe must have spent weeks, possibly months, completing the inscription. Why go to such extraordinary effort? The answer must lie in the nature of the information being recorded. Organic materials decay, burn, and dissolve. Parchment can be eaten by insects, destroyed by moisture, consumed by fire. Even in the dry climate of Qumran, parchment scrolls required careful storage in sealed jars to survive. But copper is nearly indestructible. It oxidizes on the surface, but the metal beneath remains intact indefinitely. It cannot burn. Water cannot dissolve it. Insects and rodents cannot consume it. Even if buried in soil or submerged in water, copper will survive for millennia. The choice of copper was a declaration that this information was too important to risk losing, that it had to survive no matter what catastrophe might befall the community. This suggests that the creators of the scroll anticipated their own deaths or dispersal, that they knew they might never return to retrieve the treasures themselves. The language of the copper scroll adds another layer of mystery. While it is written in Hebrew like most other Dead Sea Scrolls, the dialect is noticeably different. The Hebrew contains numerous Greek loanwords, particularly technical and architectural terms. Words for specific types of buildings, measurements, and construction features are borrowed directly from Greek, suggesting the scribe was familiar with Hellenistic culture and terminology. This makes sense in the context of 1st century Judea, which had been under Greek cultural influence for centuries. But it also suggests that the scroll might have been created by someone with a more cosmopolitan background than the typical Essene scribe, someone who had exposure to the wider Mediterranean world. The vocabulary includes terms not found in biblical Hebrew or in other Qumran texts, local place names, and technical jargon that would have been familiar to residents of Jerusalem, but might puzzle someone from outside the region. The grammar is also peculiar, simpler and more direct than the elaborate Hebrew found in religious texts. Sentences are short and declarative. Subject, verb, object, with minimal embellishment. In the cistern that is in Beth Hakkerem, in the reservoir, 10 talents. In the monument which is at the mouth of the valley of Achor, under the large stone at the eastern entrance, 42 talents. This stripped-down style serves a practical purpose, eliminating any ambiguity or poetic flourish that might obscure the literal meaning. But it also makes the scroll feel almost modern, like reading a technical manual or warehouse inventory rather than an ancient religious text. The contrast with the soaring poetry of the Psalms scroll or the mystical visions of the War Scroll could not be more pronounced. Here was a document concerned only with facts, with quantities and locations that could be verified and acted upon. The sheer number of locations mentioned in the Copper Scroll is itself remarkable. 64 separate hiding places, each carefully described with measurements and landmarks. The geographical spread covers a wide area around Jerusalem and the Dead Sea. Some locations are within the city itself, others in the Judean wilderness, still others near towns and villages throughout the region. This distribution pattern suggests a systematic effort to scatter the treasures across multiple sites rather than concentrating them in one location. The logic is obvious, the same principle that leads people to diversify investments rather than keeping all their wealth in one place. If enemies discovered one cache, the others would remain safe. If one location became inaccessible, alternatives would still be available. The strategy shows sophisticated planning, suggesting that the hiding of treasures was not a desperate last-minute action, but a carefully organized operation. Each entry in the scroll follows a similar formula. First comes a location identifier, usually a well-known landmark or architectural feature. Then measurements, typically in cubits, indicating how far and in which direction to proceed from the landmark. Finally, the contents of the cache and their quantity, measured in talents or other ancient units. In the tomb, which is in the watercourse of the valley, 400 talents. In the grave, which is on the road descending from Jericho to Sekaka, 65 gold bars. In the cistern, which is below the rampart on the east side, at a depth of 19 cubits, 600 talents of silver. The repetitive structure makes the scroll read like a spreadsheet, each row containing data fields that someone with the right knowledge should be able to interpret and use. But 2,000 years later, almost every element presents insurmountable problems. Consider the measurements. The scroll uses cubits as its standard unit of length, but ancient cubits varied significantly depending on region and time period. The Egyptian royal cubit was about 52 centimeters. The Roman cubit was closer to 44 centimeters. The Hebrew cubit mentioned in the Bible might have been anywhere from 45 to 55 centimeters depending on interpretation. Without knowing which cubit the scroll's creator was using, every measurement becomes approximate. When the text says, "dig down 19 cubits," that could mean anywhere from 8 to 10 meters, a significant range when you're searching for a specific burial spot. And that assumes the starting point is correctly identified, which leads to even more difficult problems. The landmarks mentioned in the scroll would have been obvious to someone living in Jerusalem in 70 AD, but they mean almost nothing to modern researchers. What is the monument at Beth Hakerem? Which tomb is meant by the tomb near the irrigation channel? Jerusalem had hundreds of tombs, dozens of cisterns, multiple temples and monuments. The scroll assumes intimate familiarity with the pre-destruction city, knowledge that has been almost entirely lost. After the Roman destruction, Jerusalem was rebuilt on the ruins. New buildings erected over old foundations, the topography altered by 2 millennia of construction and modification. Archaeological excavations have revealed layers of history, but they can only recover fragments of the original city. Most of the architectural features mentioned in the Copper Scroll have vanished without trace, their locations unknown and possibly unknowable. Even the broader geographical references present challenges. The scroll mentions places like Sekaka, Kolit, and Achor, names that appear in biblical texts but whose precise locations are debated by scholars. Sekaka is mentioned in the Book of Joshua as a city in the Judean wilderness, but its exact site has never been definitively identified. Multiple archaeological tells in the region have been proposed as candidates, but none can be confirmed with certainty. If we cannot pinpoint where Sekaka was, how can we follow directions that begin in the cistern at Sekaka? Every uncertainty compounds the previous one, creating a cascade of ambiguity that makes treasure hunting based on the scroll effectively impossible without additional information. This brings us back to the tantalizing final line of the scroll, the reference to another document that supposedly explains everything. In the pit adjoining on the north, in a hole opening northwards and buried at its mouth, a copy of this document with an explanation and their measurements, and an inventory of each thing and other things. This passage has driven researchers to distraction for decades. It clearly states that somewhere there is a duplicate of the Copper Scroll, along with explanatory material that would clarify the cryptic directions. It promises their measurements, suggesting standardized units would be specified. It mentions an inventory of each thing, implying detailed descriptions of what each cache contains. And those mysterious other things hint at additional information we cannot even guess at. If this explanatory scroll could be found, the entire mystery might be solved in an instant. But 70 years of searching have yielded no trace of this second scroll. It may have been destroyed, melted down for its metal value if found by the Romans or later treasure seekers. It may still be buried somewhere, in a location described so vaguely that no one has yet identified it. Or the description might be deliberately misleading, a false lead to protect the real hiding place of the explanatory document. Some researchers have theorized that the explanatory scroll was kept separate from the copper scroll precisely to add an extra layer of security. Even if enemies captured one scroll, they wouldn't be able to use it without the other. This would make sense from a security perspective, but it also means that losing either scroll renders both useless. 2,000 years later, we have one half of a code book with no way to decipher the other half. The material composition of the scroll itself has been extensively analyzed. Metallurgical studies show that the copper is approximately 99% pure, with trace amounts of tin and other metals. This level of purity suggests that the copper was refined specifically for this purpose, rather than being repurposed from coins or decorative objects. The presence of tin raises interesting questions about provenance. Pure copper was available in the ancient Near East from several sources, but copper with tin content often came from specific mining regions. Chemical analysis could potentially trace the metal to its source, though this has not yet been conclusively done. If the copper's origin could be established, it might provide clues about who created the scroll and where they obtained their materials. A wealthy institution like the temple could afford imported copper. A small desert community like Qumran probably could not, unless they had access to external funding or resources. The physical condition of the scroll when found also tells a story. The copper had oxidized into a characteristic green patina, copper carbonate formed by reaction with moisture and carbon dioxide over millennia. But beneath this surface corrosion, the metal remained structurally intact, exactly as the ancient scribes must have hoped. However, the oxidation had fused the rolled layers together so tightly that unrolling was impossible without fracturing the brittle metal. This is why Professor Wright Baker's sawing technique was necessary, cutting the scroll into segments that could be examined individually. Each cut revealed text on both the outer and inner surfaces where the copper had been rolled on itself. Piecing together the full text required careful alignment of the fragments, matching the columns and ensuring nothing was missed. The process was painstaking and irreversible, forever altering the scroll's physical form, but making its content accessible for the first time in 2,000 years. Comparison with other Dead Sea Scrolls reveals just how anomalous the Copper Scroll is. The religious texts found at Qumran were clearly produced by a community dedicated to spiritual purity and biblical study. The scribes who copied the Book of Isaiah or the community rule were trained professionals, their handwriting elegant and consistent, their work reflecting years of practice and devotion. These scrolls were the products of a scribal tradition going back centuries, following established conventions for layout, orthography, and content. The Copper Scroll breaks all these rules. Its letter forms are crude and irregular, punched rather than written, functional rather than artistic. Its content is secular and material rather than spiritual. Its very existence suggests that at some point, the Qumran community had to deal with practical matters of wealth and treasure, concerns that seem at odds with their reputation as ascetic desert dwellers. This contradiction has led some scholars to question whether the Copper Scroll actually belonged to the Essene community at all. Perhaps it was hidden in Cave 3 by someone else, taking advantage of the cave system's remoteness and the presence of other scrolls as camouflage. Jerusalem was in chaos in 70 AD, with different factions fighting each other as well as the Romans. Zealots, Sadducees, Pharisees, and various revolutionary groups all had their own agendas and resources. Any of them might have chosen Qumran as a hiding place for treasures, especially if they knew the caves were already being used to store important documents. The copper scroll could have been deposited before, during, or after the other scrolls by people with no connection to the Essenes. Its presence in Cave 3 might be coincidental rather than meaningful, a case of different groups choosing the same good hiding spot for different reasons. Yet there are connections that cannot be dismissed. The scroll was rolled and stored similarly to other scrolls from the cave. The Hebrew dialect, while unusual, shares characteristics with other Qumran texts. The dating places it firmly in the same historical period as the community's final years. Most tellingly, the scroll was still there, undisturbed, when archaeologists found it. If the Romans had discovered Cave 3 during their sweep of the region after 70 AD, they would have removed or destroyed everything, including the copper. The fact that the scroll survived suggests it was successfully hidden and never recovered by those who concealed it. This fits perfectly with the scenario of the Essene community being destroyed or scattered in the war, unable to return to their desert refuge and reclaim what they had preserved. The copper scroll's survival is paradoxically evidence of its creator's failure, proof that no one ever came back to retrieve the treasures it described. The question of authenticity ultimately comes down to motive and means. If the scroll is a hoax or folklore, who created it and why? The investment in copper alone argues against casual fabrication. The technical knowledge required to work the metal and create legible text was not trivial. The geographical and architectural details, while cryptic to us, suggest familiarity with first-century Jerusalem that would be difficult to fake. And the context of the scroll's discovery, sealed in a cave with other authentic ancient documents, makes modern forgery virtually impossible. The scroll has to be ancient, and it has to represent someone's genuine attempt to record information they considered vitally important. Whether that information describes real treasures or legendary ones remains the central mystery, but the scroll itself is unquestionably a genuine artifact from the tumultuous final days of Second Temple Judaism. The quantities of treasure listed in the copper scroll are staggering enough to strain credulity. When scholars first translated the text and calculated the totals, many simply refused to believe the numbers could be accurate. The scroll mentions gold and silver measured in talents, an ancient unit of weight that varied by region and period but typically represented between 25 and 35 kilograms. Using conservative estimates, the 64 caches described in the scroll would contain approximately 26 tons of gold and 65 tons of silver. To put this in perspective, that amount of gold would fill several large rooms, requiring teams of men and animals to transport. The silver would occupy even more space, its lower density meaning greater volume for the same weight. We're talking about wealth on a scale that few ancient institutions could have accumulated, let alone hidden in scattered locations across the Judean wilderness. Consider what 26 tons of gold represented in the ancient world. The annual tribute that Rome extracted from all of Judea at its height was measured in hundreds of talents total, combining gold, silver, and agricultural products. The temple treasury, fed by pilgrims from across the diaspora for generations, certainly held substantial reserves, but historical sources give us no indication it contained anything approaching the quantities listed in the copper scroll. When Titus looted Jerusalem in 70 AD, ancient historians recorded that he carried off enormous wealth. But again, the descriptions suggest hundreds rather than thousands of talents. If the copper scroll is accurate, it describes more precious metal than was publicly known to exist in all of Judea. This has led many scholars to conclude that the numbers must be exaggerated, symbolic, or simply fictional. But others argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that the temple and wealthy families might have hidden reserves that never appeared in historical records. Let's examine some specific entries to understand the scale. Location number 4 in the scroll reads, "In the monument which is in the second platform, 900 talents." 900 talents of gold would weigh approximately 27,000 kilograms, or 27 metric tons. That's more gold than most modern banks hold in their vaults. It's enough gold to fill a small swimming pool. The logistics of hiding such a quantity boggle the mind. How many men would be needed to carry it? How long would the operation take? What kind of monument could conceal such bulk? The entry is presented matter-of-factly, sandwiched between other locations as if hiding 27 tons of gold were routine. Either the scroll's creator was recording fantasy on a grand scale, or something extraordinary was happening in Jerusalem that we don't fully understand from historical sources. Another entry mentions, in the great cistern which is in the courtyard of the small colonnade, sealed in the wall opposite the upper door, 900 talents. Again, 900 talents, this time explicitly stated to be sealed within a wall near a cistern. The description provides architectural details that sound specific and concrete. There's a courtyard with a colonnade, a cistern within that courtyard, a wall with an upper door, and somewhere in or near that wall, 900 talents are concealed. To someone familiar with the location, these directions might be perfectly clear. But to us, they raise more questions than they answer. Which courtyard? Jerusalem had dozens. Which colonnade? The temple complex alone had multiple colonnaded areas. And how exactly does one seal 900 talents of precious metal into a wall without the modification being obvious? The entry assumes knowledge we don't possess and describes an engineering feat that seems almost impossible. The smaller caches are no less intriguing. In the tomb, which is in the watercourse of the valley, 400 talents. In the cistern, which is below the rampart on the east side, at a depth of 19 cubits, 600 talents of silver. In the grave, which is on the road descending from Jericho to Sekasa, 65 gold bars. These entries provide the kind of specific details that treasure hunters dream about. Measurements in cubits, cardinal directions, references to roads and landmarks. Yet every expedition that has attempted to follow these clues has come up empty. Either the descriptions are too vague without additional context, or the landscape has changed so dramatically that the landmarks no longer exist, or the treasures were recovered long ago by people who had the knowledge we lack. Or perhaps the quantities are coded, the numbers representing something other than literal weights, a possibility that makes the mystery even more impenetrable. Some entries mention items rather than raw bullion, adding specificity that seems to argue for authenticity. In the eastern cistern, which is in the ravine at Sekasa, at its entrance, a vessel containing incense offerings. In the plastered reservoir in the southern corner at Beth Hakarim, burial urns and consecrated objects. These descriptions move beyond simple quantities of metal to identify specific artifacts. Incense offerings suggest temple-related items, materials used in religious ceremonies. Burial urns and consecrated objects imply sacred items that couldn't simply be melted down and sold. The scroll is not just listing treasure in an abstract sense, it's cataloging particular vessels and objects that someone would recognize. This level of detail is inconsistent with folklore or legend, which tends toward the generic. Real inventory lists mention specific items because their creators intend for someone to find and identify exactly what was hidden. The largest single cache mentioned in the scroll is almost beyond comprehension. In the underground passage that is in the smooth rock at the intersection, 17 talents of gold and 600 talents of silver. Combined, this represents over 20 tons of precious metal in a single location. The description of an underground passage in smooth rock could refer to one of Jerusalem's many ancient water tunnels, cistern systems, or defensive passages. The city was honeycombed with such structures, some dating back centuries before the Roman period. Many have been discovered by archaeologists, but many more likely remain hidden beneath modern construction. Could one of these unknown passages contain the cache described in the scroll? The possibility tantalizes researchers, but without knowing which passage is meant, the chances of stumbling upon the right one are infinitesimal. To understand whether these quantities are plausible, we need to consider the economics of Second Temple Judaism. Jerusalem was not just a religious center, but also a major financial hub. The temple served as a de facto central bank, accepting deposits, making loans, and managing the monetary system. Pilgrims from across the Mediterranean brought offerings during festivals, with estimates suggesting that hundreds of thousands of visitors came to Jerusalem for Passover alone. Each brought money, animals for sacrifice, and gifts for the temple. Over decades and centuries, this steady flow of wealth would have accumulated substantially. The temple also collected tithes from Jews throughout the diaspora, a 10% religious tax on income and agricultural produce. Much of this came in the form of coins and precious metals. By 70 AD, the temple treasury could plausibly have contained vast reserves. Additionally, wealthy Jewish families used the temple as a secure repository for their valuables. Like modern safe deposit boxes, the temple offered protection that individual homes could not match. Documents from the period mention families depositing gold, jewelry, and important papers in temple storage. If war threatened and the temple itself was at risk, these depositors would have wanted their property protected. A coordinated effort to hide the temple's accumulated wealth, both institutional and private deposits, could account for the scale described in the copper scroll. This interpretation suggests the scroll represents not one person's treasure, but a community effort to preserve the collective wealth of Jerusalem's Jewish population in the face of Roman conquest. The scroll also mentions some entries that are puzzling in their specificity. At the quarry on the eastern side, under the entrance to the passage, 42 talents. Why would a quarry be chosen as a hiding place? Quarries were working sites, frequently visited by laborers and overseers. Hiding treasure there would seem risky. Unless the quarry was no longer active in 70 AD, abandoned and forgotten, which would make it an excellent location precisely because no one would think to look there. Or perhaps quarry is a code word for something else, a term that meant one thing to insiders but misleads outsiders. The scroll may contain multiple layers of obscurity, protecting its secrets even if the document fell into hostile hands. Directions that seem clear might be deliberately misleading, while the real locations require additional knowledge to decode. Another mysterious entry reads, "In the plastered reservoir which is at the gateway of the valley, in the hidden chamber at its bottom, 2 talents of gold." The mention of a hidden chamber at the bottom of a reservoir is fascinating. Ancient engineers were skilled at creating concealed spaces within public structures. A reservoir would typically have a sedimentation chamber or inspection shaft that could be adapted to hide valuables. But describing it in a treasure map seems to defeat the purpose of hiding it. Unless the hidden chamber was genuinely invisible to casual inspection, perhaps behind a false wall or underwater, accessible only to someone who knew the secret of its construction. The scroll assumes its readers will understand these technical details, that they'll know how to access hidden chambers and identify the right reservoir from a general description. The geographical distribution of the hiding places tells its own story. While some locations are clearly within Jerusalem itself, others spread across the Judean wilderness, near Jericho, around the Dead Sea, and in the hill country. This wide dispersal suggests a systematic plan rather than panic-driven improvisation. Someone coordinated the distribution of treasures across multiple sites, ensuring that no single raid or discovery could capture everything. The pattern resembles modern strategies for protecting valuable assets, diversifying locations to minimize risk. It also implies an organization capable of moving large quantities of metal across considerable distances, with the resources and personnel to execute such a complex operation. The Essene community at Qumran alone probably lacked these capabilities, but the temple hierarchy with its network of priests and Levites could have managed it. Some entries explicitly mention gold bars rather than coins or raw metal. In the grave, which is on the road descending from Jericho to Sekasa, 65 gold bars. Gold bars imply refined, standardized ingots rather than random pieces or jewelry. This suggests institutional wealth, official reserves that had been processed into convenient, transportable units. Temple treasuries often stored gold in bar form for exactly this reason, making it easier to count, weigh, and transport when necessary. The mention of 65 bars is oddly specific, the kind of precise inventory number that comes from actual records rather than guesswork. If someone were inventing a treasure legend, they might say, "many gold bars," or "a great quantity of gold." Saying exactly 65 bars sounds like someone copying from an actual manifest. The scroll also references silver in various forms, sometimes measured in talents, other times described as vessels or objects. In the cistern, which is below the rampart on the east side, at a depth of 19 cubits, 600 talents of silver. 600 talents of silver would weigh approximately 18,000 kilograms or 18 metric tons. This is an almost unimaginable quantity to hide in a cistern at a depth of 19 cubits, which would be somewhere between 8 and 10 meters down. Lowering that much weight into a narrow cistern shaft would require sophisticated lifting equipment and considerable time. Yet the scroll describes it as if it were a straightforward matter, another location on the list. Either ancient engineers had capabilities we underestimate, or the entry describes something different from what we imagine when we read the words. The question of whether these quantities are literal or symbolic has occupied scholars for decades. Some argue that the numbers might be coded, perhaps multiplied by some factor, or expressed in non-standard units. If each talent actually represented a tenth of a standard talent, the totals would be more reasonable, though still substantial. Other researchers suggest the numbers might be cumulative or representative, recording not what was in each location, but the total value distributed across multiple unspecified sites. This would explain why following the scroll's directions hasn't led to treasure. The locations are general categories rather than specific coordinates. But this interpretation requires assuming the scroll's creators were being deliberately obscure, which contradicts the document's apparent purpose as a practical guide for recovery. Perhaps the most compelling evidence that the scroll describes real treasures comes from the very existence of the document itself. Creating the copper scroll required significant investment in materials and labor. In the ancient world, copper suitable for writing was expensive, comparable in value to several months of a skilled worker's wages. The time and expertise needed to inscribe the text added further cost. Would anyone invest such resources to record fantasy? Folklore and legends were transmitted orally or written on cheap materials precisely because they were entertainment rather than vital information. The copper scroll's medium declares its importance. The message was worth preserving at nearly any cost. This strongly suggests the information was valuable, that whoever created the scroll believed future generations would need and be able to use it. Whether they were correct is another question, but their belief seems genuine. The psychological dimension of the scroll is also revealing. Imagine being among the last defenders of Jerusalem, watching the city fall to Roman legions. Your world is ending, your temple burning, your people being slaughtered or enslaved. In that moment of ultimate catastrophe, you choose to spend precious time and resources creating a record of hidden wealth. This act represents hope against hope, a desperate belief that somehow, someday, someone will survive to reclaim what you're hiding. The copper scroll is a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean of time, sent by people who knew they were doomed but refused to let everything be lost. Whether the treasures were real or not, the emotional reality of that moment is captured in every punched letter on the copper sheets. These were people fighting to preserve something of their world for a future they would never see. The challenge of decoding the copper scroll begins with the most basic problem: identifying locations that no longer exist in any recognizable form. When the scroll mentions the monument which is in the second platform, it assumes the reader knows which monument, which platform, and where to find them. In 70 AD Jerusalem, these would have been familiar landmarks, as obvious to locals as the Statue of Liberty is to New Yorkers today. But the Roman destruction was so thorough that Josephus wrote the city was leveled to the point where visitors could not believe it had ever been inhabited. The Temple Mount was plowed under. Buildings were demolished stone by stone. The entire urban landscape was erased and rebuilt multiple times over the following 2 millennia. Modern Jerusalem sits on layers of ruins, each representing a different era of construction and destruction. Somewhere beneath those layers are the monuments and platforms mentioned in the scroll, but pinpointing them is nearly impossible. The problem compounds when we consider how place names change over time. The scroll mentions locations like Beth Haxarim, Sekasa, and Kolit, names that appear in biblical texts but have uncertain modern equivalents. Beth Haxarim is mentioned in the book of Nehemiah as a district of Judah, and Jeremiah references it as a signal station. Most scholars believe it corresponds to Ramat Rachel, a site south of Jerusalem where Iron Age ruins have been found. But most scholars believe is not the same as definitively know. If Beth Haxarim is actually somewhere else, then every treasure supposedly hidden there remains unfindable. The same uncertainty applies to nearly every geographical reference in the scroll. We have educated guesses, probable identifications, and reasonable theories, but very little absolute certainty about where ancient place names correspond to modern locations. Even when we think we know where a location is, the descriptions remain maddeningly vague. Take the entry that reads, "In the cistern which is below the rampart on the east side, at a depth of 19 cubits, 600 talents of silver." Jerusalem had miles of ramparts on all sides, each with multiple cisterns. The east side narrows it somewhat, but dozens of cisterns existed on the eastern sections of the city walls. Below the rampart could mean inside the wall system, outside the wall but nearby, or underneath in some subterranean chamber. At a depth of 19 cubits sounds specific, but measured from where? From the ground surface? From the top of the cistern? From the water level? And which cubit measurement system is being used? Without answers to these questions, even standing at the correct cistern wouldn't guarantee finding the treasure. You could dig in the wrong spot, to the wrong depth, and miss the cache by meters. The architectural terminology presents additional obstacles. The scroll uses Hebrew words for various structures and features that don't always translate clearly into modern languages. Words that might mean platform, monument, tower, or building, in different contexts are used without clarification. When the text mentions a double pool, does it mean two separate pools adjacent to each other, or one pool with a dividing wall, or a pool with two chambers? The original readers presumably knew from seeing the actual structure, but were left guessing based on fragmentary vocabulary. Archaeological Hebrew lexicons help somewhat, but they're based on limited sources and can't capture all the nuances of colloquial usage in first-century Jerusalem. The scroll's language may include local slang, professional jargon, or technical terms that were perfectly clear to contemporary residents, but are obscure to modern scholars. Measurements add another layer of frustration. The cubit was the standard unit of length in the ancient Near East, but it varied significantly by region and period. The Egyptian royal cubit measured approximately 52.4 centimeters. The Mesopotamian cubit was closer to 50 centimeters. The standard Hebrew cubit mentioned in the Bible is usually estimated at about 44.5 centimeters, roughly 17.5 inches. But some scholars argue for a longer Hebrew cubit of up to 52 centimeters, based on archaeological evidence from royal construction projects. This range means that 19 cubits could be anywhere from 8.5 to 10 meters, a difference of 1.5 meters or about 5 feet. When you're digging underground searching for a specific cache, being off by 5 feet in any direction means you'll miss it entirely. The scroll's creators knew which cubit they were using, but that knowledge died with them. Directional references create similar problems. The scroll frequently uses cardinal directions, telling readers to go east, west, north, or south from a given landmark. But how were these directions determined in the first century? Modern compasses weren't available. People navigated by the sun, stars, and prominent geographical features. In Jerusalem's hilly terrain, with its complex urban layout, east from one vantage point might be quite different from east as measured by magnetic north. The ancient concept of cardinal directions may have been more approximate and contextual than our modern GPS-trained minds assume. When the scroll says to go eastward 40 cubits, it probably means something like toward the sunrise direction, rather than a precise bearing of 90 degrees. This introduces uncertainty into every measurement and direction given in the text. The first serious attempt to use the copper scroll to find actual treasure came in 1960, led by British scholar John Allegro. Allegro was a member of the original Dead Sea Scrolls translation team and one of the few scholars who insisted the scroll described real rather than legendary treasures. He obtained permission from Jordanian authorities, who controlled the West Bank at that time, to excavate at Qumran and nearby sites. Allegro brought archaeological equipment, hired local workers, and spent months trying to identify and excavate locations matching the scroll's descriptions. He was convinced that the scroll's geographical references pointed to areas around Qumran and the northwestern Dead Sea shore. His team dug at numerous spots, following what Allegro believed were clear indicators in the text. They found pottery, coins, and evidence of ancient habitation, but no treasure. Allegro's failure was not for lack of effort or dedication. He documented everything meticulously, photographed sites, and published detailed reports of his excavations. But the fundamental problem was that the scroll's directions were written for people who already knew the landscape intimately. Allegro was working from maps and surveys, trying to match ancient descriptions to modern geography. He had to guess which ruins corresponded to which ancient structures, estimate where measurements began and ended, and interpret ambiguous Hebrew terms with incomplete information. In retrospect, it's impressive he identified any plausible locations at all. The academic community was less generous. Many scholars saw Allegro's expedition as proof that the scroll was fictional, that anyone who took it seriously was wasting time and money on a wild goose chase. Allegro's professional reputation suffered, though he never abandoned his belief that the treasures were real and simply hadn't been found yet. The next major attempt came decades later, in 1988, when Texas explorer Vendell Jones led an expedition to the Qumran area. Jones was an unusual figure, a Christian minister who became fascinated with Jewish archaeology and the Dead Sea Scrolls. He spent years studying the Copper Scroll and believed he had identified the location of one of the incense caches mentioned in the text. Using ground-penetrating radar and other modern survey techniques, Jones's team identified what appeared to be a cavity in the rock near Qumran. When they excavated, they found a jug containing a reddish substance. Jones claimed this was the ancient incense mentioned in the scroll, and laboratory analysis showed it contained compounds consistent with temple incense recipes. However, other scholars disputed this identification, arguing that the substance could be various things and that Jones's connection to the Copper Scroll was speculative at best. Jones continued searching for years, convinced he was close to a major discovery. He identified additional sites and conducted multiple excavations, always certain that the next dig would reveal the treasure. In 1992, his team found another jug containing what Jones called oil of anointing, again arguing it matched descriptions in the Copper Scroll and other ancient Jewish texts. But skeptics pointed out that finding ancient oil in clay jars near Qumran, where a Jewish community lived for generations, was not particularly surprising and didn't prove the Copper Scroll's accuracy. Jones needed to find gold or silver in quantities matching the scroll's descriptions to validate his theories. He never did. When he died in 2010, he was still convinced the treasures existed and that he had been searching in the right areas, just hadn't pinpointed the exact spots. The most technologically sophisticated attempt to decode the scroll came in 2007, when retired arson investigator Jim Barfield applied modern analytical techniques to the ancient text. Barfield had no academic training in archaeology or ancient languages, but he brought a fresh perspective informed by his experience investigating crimes and following complex clues. He spent years studying the scroll, cross-referencing it with biblical texts, historical documents, and archaeological reports. Using geographic information systems and satellite imagery, Barfield identified what he believed were 9 specific locations mentioned in the scroll. Several were in and around the old city of Jerusalem, others near Qumran. He presented his findings to the Israel Antiquities Authority, requesting permission to excavate or at least conduct non-invasive surveys using ground-penetrating radar. Barfield's request was denied, but the reasons were more political than academic. Some of the sites he identified were in the Old City, areas sacred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Any excavation there would require navigating complex permissions from multiple religious authorities and could spark international controversy. Other sites were in Area C of the West Bank, under Israeli military control but politically sensitive. The Israeli government had no interest in approving excavations that could become diplomatic incidents. Barfield found himself in the frustrating position of believing he had solved a 2,000-year-old mystery, but being unable to prove it because he wasn't allowed to dig. He gave lectures, wrote articles, and appeared in documentaries explaining his theories. But without physical evidence, he couldn't convince the skeptics. The fundamental problem all these treasure hunters face is that the copper scroll was never meant to be self-sufficient. It was written as a guide for people who already had extensive knowledge of the locations. The scroll provides memory aids and specific details to help someone find the exact spot within a general area they already know. It's like someone giving you directions to their house by saying, "Turn left at the big tree, go straight until the red barn, then right at the creek." These directions are perfectly clear if you're familiar with the neighborhood, but useless if you're coming from another state and have never seen the tree, barn, or creek. The scroll assumes intimate local knowledge that has been completely lost. Without that context, even the most detailed analysis of the text cannot recreate the full picture the ancient authors had in mind. Language evolution adds another complication. The Hebrew of the Copper Scroll includes terms and constructions that don't appear in biblical texts or other contemporary documents. Some words occur only once in all of ancient Hebrew literature, what linguists call hapax legomena. How do we translate a word that appears nowhere else? We make educated guesses based on context and cognates in related languages, but these remain guesses. If a key word in a location description is mistranslated, the entire direction becomes worthless. Consider the entry, "In the tomb that is in the watercourse of the valley, 400 talents." The word translated as watercourse could also mean valley floor, stream bed, or several other things depending on context. Each translation leads to a completely different search area. Without other examples to confirm the meaning, translators must choose based on their best judgment, knowing they might be wrong. The physical condition of the scroll when it was opened created additional transcription challenges. Corrosion had damaged some sections, making certain letters unclear or completely illegible. In these cases, translators had to reconstruct missing text based on context, similar entries elsewhere in the scroll, and assumptions about what would make sense. Bracketed portions in published translations indicate where the original text is damaged, and scholars have filled in what they believe was originally written. But these reconstructions are hypothetical. If a critical measurement or direction falls in a damaged section, we might be reading a scholarly guess rather than the actual ancient text. The margin for error in these restorations could be the difference between finding and missing a treasure cache. Modern technology offers new possibilities for analysis that weren't available to earlier researchers. Computer algorithms can analyze the scroll's language patterns, looking for hidden structures or codes. Artificial intelligence can cross-reference the scroll with thousands of other ancient texts, identifying linguistic connections and parallels that human scholars might miss. Geographic information systems can overlay ancient maps with modern terrain, helping to identify probable locations for place names that have changed. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies can detect underground cavities, metal deposits, and structural anomalies without excavation. In theory, these tools should make finding the Copper Scroll treasures easier than ever. In practice, they've mostly served to eliminate possibilities rather than confirm locations. The tantalizing possibility that remains is that someone actually has decoded the scroll and found treasure without reporting it. If you discovered 20 tons of gold based on the Copper Scroll, would you tell the authorities? In Israel, archaeological finds belong to the state. Reporting a major treasure discovery would mean surrendering it to museums and government repositories, receiving at most a finder's fee. The temptation to keep quiet and gradually liquidate the treasure on the black market would be enormous. Gold and silver are fungible commodities, easily sold without revealing their source. Ancient artifacts would be harder to dispose of quietly, but raw bullion could be melted down and sold as modern metal. A clever finder might spend years or decades gradually converting their discovery into liquid assets, never revealing the source. This paranoid scenario can't be disproven, and it haunts serious researchers who worry that the treasure might already be gone. The theory that the Copper Scroll describes treasures from the Second Temple in Jerusalem is both the most widely accepted and the most problematic explanation for the document's contents. The timing of the scroll's creation, around 70 AD, coincides exactly with the Roman siege and destruction of Jerusalem. This was the defining catastrophe of first-century Jewish history, when Titus and his legions breached the walls, slaughtered the defenders, enslaved the survivors, and systematically demolished the temple that had stood at the center of Jewish religious life for over 500 years. Ancient sources describe the Romans carting away enormous quantities of gold and silver from the temple, wealth that was paraded through Rome in Titus's triumphal procession. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome today, depicts soldiers carrying the temple menorah and other sacred objects. But what if the Romans didn't get everything? What if priests and Levites, seeing the inevitable fall approaching, managed to hide the most valuable and sacred items before the final collapse? The Second Temple was not just a religious building but the economic heart of Jewish society. It functioned as a central bank, mint, and treasury combined. Pilgrims from across the Mediterranean and beyond brought offerings during the 3 annual pilgrimage festivals. The temple tax, a half-shekel levy on every adult Jewish male, generated enormous revenue that flowed to Jerusalem from Jewish communities in Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome. Wealthy families deposited valuables in temple storerooms for safekeeping, trusting the sanctity and security of the holy site more than their own homes. By 70 AD, the temple treasury had been accumulating wealth for over 5 centuries since its reconstruction after the Babylonian exile. The quantities mentioned in the Copper Scroll, while enormous, might represent only a portion of what the temple actually held at its peak. Historical sources give us glimpses of the temple's wealth that support the possibility of massive hidden reserves. Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, mentions that the temple stored enormous quantities of gold and silver. He describes the inner chambers decorated with gold plate, the golden vine with clusters as tall as a man, the sacred vessels made of precious metals. When the Romans broke into the temple treasury, Josephus writes that they were astonished by the wealth they found. But he also hints that not everything was discovered, that some treasures had been hidden or removed before the final assault. Josephus himself was a former priest who had intimate knowledge of the temple complex, and his careful wording suggests he knew more than he was willing to write explicitly, aware that Roman censors would read his work. The Essene community at Qumran had complex connections to the Jerusalem priesthood. While they had separated themselves from the temple establishment, considering it corrupt and the priests illegitimate, they were themselves led by priests from established priestly families. Many scholars believe the Essenes were Zadokite priests who left Jerusalem in protest but maintained their priestly identity and knowledge of temple procedures. When war came, these connections might have led to cooperation between the Jerusalem priests and the Qumran community. The priests would have needed secure hiding places outside the city, locations the Romans wouldn't immediately think to search. Qumran, isolated in the desert, connected to Jerusalem by little-traveled paths, would have been an ideal repository. The Essenes, despite their theological differences with the temple hierarchy, would have shared a common interest in preserving Jewish sacred objects and wealth from Roman confiscation. This scenario explains several puzzling aspects of the Copper Scroll. It accounts for why such a secular document was found among religious texts. The scroll would have been part of a coordinated hiding operation, placed in Cave 3 along with other important documents to keep them together and maximize chances that survivors would find the full collection. It explains the use of expensive copper. The temple treasury could afford such material and would have considered it essential for preserving information about their hidden wealth. It makes sense of the scroll's geographic distribution, with caches scattered across the region rather than concentrated in one place. Temple officials would have understood the principle of diversification, not putting all their treasures in one location where a single discovery would cost them everything. And it provides motivation for the entire operation. These weren't random people hiding personal wealth. They were the guardians of Judaism's holiest site, desperate to preserve what they could for future generations. But this elegant theory faces serious challenges. The first is the scale. Even granting that the temple was immensely wealthy, could it really have contained the 26 tons of gold and 65 tons of silver mentioned in the scroll? Ancient sources, while describing the temple as rich, don't suggest reserves on this scale. When we read about the wealth of other ancient temples and treasuries, the quantities are impressive, but measured in hundreds rather than thousands of talents. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi, one of the wealthiest religious institutions in the ancient Mediterranean, held reserves estimated at several tons of precious metals at most. For Jerusalem's temple to have hidden away quantities 10 times larger than Delphi's entire treasury seems implausible unless there's something fundamental we're missing about 1st century Jewish economic organization. The second problem is organizational. Hiding 26 tons of gold requires a massive logistical operation. Each talent weighed approximately 30 kilograms, so we're talking about moving roughly 870 loads of 30 kilograms each, plus even more silver. This would require hundreds of people, pack animals, transportation across difficult terrain, and significant time. All of this would have to happen while Jerusalem was under siege, with Roman soldiers controlling the roads and surrounding countryside. The accounts of the siege describe a city cut off and starving, with residents barely able to move within the walls, let alone conduct extensive operations outside the city. For priests to organize and execute the distribution of treasures to 64 locations across the region under these conditions strains credibility. Unless the hiding began well before the siege tightened, perhaps as early as 66 AD when the revolt against Rome first began, and far-sighted leaders recognized the eventual outcome. If we accept an earlier timeline, the scenario becomes more plausible. In 66 AD, when Jewish rebels drove the Roman garrison from Jerusalem, there was a brief period of optimism. But anyone studying Roman history knew what would come next. Rome always responded to rebellion with overwhelming force. The temple leadership, or at least some portion of it, might have begun systematically preparing for the worst. Over the course of 3 or 4 years, small groups could have moved portions of the treasury to hidden locations, working slowly and carefully to avoid attracting attention. The copper scroll would have been created near the end of this process, a final accounting of where everything had been distributed. This extended timeline makes the logistics manageable and explains why the operation could have been completed without historical sources, noticing it was done gradually under the cover of normal temple business during a confusing period of rebellion and resistance. The Essene involvement becomes clearer under this timeline as well. Qumran was abandoned around 68 AD when Roman forces swept through the region during the early stages of the war. This means the scrolls, including the copper scroll, were hidden before Jerusalem's final fall. If temple priests began distributing treasures in 66 or 67 AD, they could have worked with the Qumran community while it was still inhabited. The Essenes would have provided labor, local knowledge of hiding places, and perhaps, most importantly, a cover story. Movement of goods to and from Qumran for legitimate community purposes would have masked the transfer of valuables. The decision to inscribe the inventory on copper and hide it with other Qumran scrolls ensured that if one group was captured or killed, the other might survive to recover the information. It was a redundancy system, primitive but effective given the technology available. Yet another problem with the temple treasury theory is that it doesn't explain all the entries in the scroll. Some locations mentioned are far from Jerusalem, in areas that seem to have no connection to the temple. The entry mentioning Sekaka, for instance, refers to a small settlement in the Judean wilderness, not a place where you'd expect temple priests to have influence or access. Similarly, references to tombs and graves as hiding places seem odd for sacred temple objects. Jewish law had strict purity regulations regarding contact with the dead and burial sites. Temple priests, who had to maintain high levels of ritual purity, would be especially unlikely to hide consecrated objects in tombs where they would be defiled by proximity to corpses. Unless the items being hidden were not sacred but purely monetary, raw gold and silver, without religious significance, which could be buried anywhere without violating religious law. This distinction raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps the copper scroll describes two different categories of treasure. Some entries might refer to sacred temple objects, the golden vessels, and consecrated items that had to be hidden to keep them from being profaned by Roman hands. These would have been placed in relatively clean, appropriate locations, properly sealed and protected. Other entries might describe monetary reserves, the accumulated financial wealth of the temple that was treated as secular property. These funds could be hidden anywhere convenient and secure, including tombs and cisterns that would be religiously inappropriate for sacred objects, but perfectly acceptable for money. If this interpretation is correct, the variety of hiding places in the scroll makes sense. Different types of treasure require different storage conditions based on religious law and practical considerations. The scroll's lack of religious language becomes less mysterious under the temple treasury theory. A document describing where sacred objects were hidden might include prayers, blessings, or explanations of the item's religious significance. But an inventory of financial reserves would be purely functional. The priests creating it were not writing a religious text, but a practical guide for recovering assets. Their concern was accuracy and clarity, not spirituality. The decision to write in Hebrew rather than Greek or Aramaic might have been the only concession to religious sensibility, using the language of Scripture even for a secular document. Everything else about the scroll, from its material to its content, was chosen for durability and functionality. The message was important enough to preserve at any cost, but didn't need religious embellishment to serve its purpose. If the temple treasury theory is correct, it raises the haunting question of why no one ever came back to retrieve the treasures. The most obvious answer is that everyone who knew about the operation died in the war or its aftermath. The siege of Jerusalem was apocalyptic in its brutality. Josephus estimates that over 1 million Jews died, though this figure is certainly exaggerated. But even if the real number was 1/10 of that, the casualties were staggering. The priestly class was specifically targeted by the Romans, who understood that Jewish resistance centered on religious leadership. Priests were executed, enslaved, or scattered across the empire. The institutional knowledge of the temple was destroyed along with the building itself. Anyone who knew where the treasures were hidden and had the authority to recover them was likely dead within a few years of the scroll's creation. But surely someone survived. The Essene community at Qumran, the people who hid the scrolls, must have included individuals who escaped the Roman advance. Some probably fled to other Jewish communities in Galilee, Egypt, or Mesopotamia. Why didn't they return after the war to recover the treasures? The answer might be that they couldn't. The Roman presence in Judea remained heavy for decades after 70 AD. The region was militarized, with legions stationed permanently to prevent further rebellion. Jewish survivors who returned would have been watched carefully, their movements restricted. Large-scale excavation or obviously treasure-seeking behavior would have attracted immediate attention. Even if someone knew where a cache was hidden, attempting to recover tons of gold while under Roman surveillance would be suicidal. Better to leave it buried and hope for a future opportunity that never came. Another possibility is that some treasures were recovered, but not all. The scroll lists 64 locations. Perhaps survivors managed to retrieve caches from accessible locations, places that could be approached without arousing suspicion. But other sites might have been too risky, too closely watched, or too altered by the destruction to locate precisely. The treasures in those locations remain hidden because the conditions for safe recovery never materialized. This scenario would explain why the scroll itself was left in the cave, undisturbed. If some treasures had been successfully recovered, you'd expect the scroll to have been taken as well, or at least marked to show which caches had been emptied. The fact that it remained untouched suggests that the entire operation failed, that no one ever came back with the knowledge and opportunity to use the information it contained. The most depressing interpretation of the temple treasury theory is that it represents a tragedy of miscommunication. Perhaps the priests who hid the treasures created multiple records, including the explanatory scroll mentioned in the final line of the copper scroll. They intended for copies to be distributed to trusted individuals in different locations, ensuring that if one record was lost, others would survive. But in the chaos of war, the distribution failed. The copper scroll ended up in Cave 3, but the explanatory document went somewhere else and was destroyed. Or vice versa, the explanation survived, but the main scroll was lost, leaving survivors with context but no specific locations. Without both pieces of the puzzle, the information was useless. 2,000 years later, we have one piece and are desperately trying to reconstruct the other through analysis and inference, a task that may be fundamentally impossible. The alternative to believing the copper scroll describes real treasures is accepting that it records legends, folklore, or deliberate fiction. This interpretation has considerable support among scholars who find the quantities too large, the directions too vague, and the entire enterprise too implausible to be genuine. They argue that ancient Jewish communities had rich traditions of treasure legends, stories about hidden wealth that would be revealed in messianic times or recovered by righteous individuals guided by divine intervention. These legends served social and psychological functions, providing hope during difficult periods and expressing beliefs about divine justice and future redemption. Perhaps the Copper Scroll is simply a written compilation of such oral traditions, recorded not because anyone believed the treasures were real, but because the stories themselves were considered valuable cultural property worth preserving. Support for the folklore theory comes from other ancient Jewish texts that mention hidden treasures in similar terms. The Book of Maccabees mentions treasures hidden by the prophet Jeremiah before the Babylonian destruction of the First Temple. Various apocalyptic texts describe wealth concealed by righteous figures that will be revealed at the end of days. These stories follow predictable patterns, enormous quantities of gold and silver, hidden in mysterious locations, waiting for the proper time and person to discover them. The Copper Scroll's entries fit this pattern perfectly. Could it be a collection of such legends, gathered from various sources and compiled onto copper to preserve them as a literary work rather than a practical guide? The decision to use copper might reflect the perceived value of the stories themselves, not the reality of the treasures they described. This interpretation explains several puzzling features of the scroll. The seemingly impossible quantities make sense as legendary exaggeration, the storytelling tradition that inflates numbers to create wonder and amazement. Real treasure hoards are measured in pounds or kilograms, but legendary ones are always measured in tons. The vague locations work for legends, which don't need precision because no one actually expects to find the treasure. The story is the point, not the gold. And the mixture of specific details with general descriptions is typical of folklore, which often includes arbitrary concrete elements, a red door, exactly 7 steps, a stone shaped like a lion, that give the illusion of authenticity without providing genuinely useful information. The Copper Scroll might be preserving a collection of such tales, each with its specific but ultimately meaningless details. But the folklore theory has significant weaknesses. The most obvious is the complete absence of narrative elements that characterize genuine legends. Folktales about treasure invariably include stories about how the treasure came to be hidden, who hid it, why it was necessary, and what will happen when it's found. They feature heroes, villains, divine intervention, curses protecting the treasure, and moral lessons about greed and righteousness. The Copper Scroll contains none of this. It's a bare list of locations and quantities, as emotionally engaging as a warehouse inventory. If someone were recording folk tales, why strip out all the narrative content that makes tales worth telling? What would be the point of preserving only the locations from stories, without the stories themselves? This makes no sense from a cultural preservation perspective. Furthermore, the use of copper remains inexplicable under the folklore theory. Legends were preserved through oral transmission or written on cheap materials precisely because they were entertainment rather than vital information. Every village had storytellers who could recite treasure legends from memory. There was no need to preserve them on expensive copper sheets. Even if someone wanted to create a written record, parchment or a papyrus would have been perfectly adequate and far more economical. The investment in copper suggests the creators believed this information was uniquely important and needed to survive conditions that would destroy other materials. This implies practical utility rather than literary value. You don't spend a fortune on materials to preserve stories that everyone already knows. You do it to protect information that might otherwise be lost and is essential for some future purpose. The language and style of the scroll also argue against the folklore interpretation. Legends are told in narrative, past tense, with elaborate descriptions and dramatic language. The Copper Scroll uses present tense, matter-of-fact descriptions, and technical terminology. Compare in the cistern, which is below the rampart on the east side, at a depth of 19 cubits, 600 talents of silver, with how a folk tale would describe the same thing. Long ago, when the righteous ones fled from their enemies, they hid the silver of the sanctuary in a deep cistern beneath the eastern wall, where it remains to this day awaiting the return of the faithful. The Copper Scroll's clinical style is completely inconsistent with oral tradition or legendary material. It reads like bureaucratic record-keeping, not storytelling. Another argument for authenticity is the scroll's specificity about measurements and quantities. Legends deal in generalities, vast wealth, more gold than 10 men could carry, silver beyond counting. The Copper Scroll gives exact figures that someone could verify or refute. This specificity invites checking and criticism in a way that legends carefully avoid. If you claim there are exactly 600 talents in a specific cistern, you're making a testable claim that will be proven true or false if someone excavates that cistern. Legendary treasures are always just slightly beyond reach, in locations that can't be checked or under conditions that prevent verification. The Copper Scroll's precision suggests its creators expected someone to actually use this information and wanted to ensure they found exactly what was described. Perhaps the most sophisticated version of the fictional theory argues that the scroll is neither genuine inventory nor traditional folklore, but rather a literary work, an ancient novel or historical fiction. Some scholars have suggested it might be a kind of ancient thriller, imagining what would happen if someone discovered where temple treasures were hidden. Or it could be a thought experiment by religious scholars, working out the logistics of how temple wealth could theoretically be concealed if necessary. This interpretation allows the scroll to be both fictional and serious, a work of imagination that nevertheless reflects real knowledge about Jerusalem's geography, temple administration, and ancient hiding techniques. The copper medium would reflect the author's desire to create a realistic artifact, making the fiction more convincing by presenting it as a genuine ancient document. But this literary interpretation creates more problems than it solves. Ancient Jewish literature from this period included various genres, biblical commentaries, apocalyptic visions, wisdom literature, community rules, and hymns. We have examples of all these genres from Qumran and other sources. None of them use the documentary style of the Copper Scroll. Ancient fiction, when it existed, was clearly marked as parable, allegory, or storytelling. Authors didn't create fake inventories or false documents and try to pass them off as real. The concept of historical fiction as a literary genre didn't exist in the way we understand it today. People wrote history, or they wrote stories, but they didn't deliberately blur the line between them. The idea that someone would invest enormous resources in creating a fake treasure inventory as a literary exercise is anachronistic, projecting modern concepts of fiction onto an ancient context where they don't fit. The scroll's find spot also argues against deliberate fiction. It was discovered in Cave 3 at Qumran, mixed with other Dead Sea Scrolls that are unquestionably authentic ancient documents. If the Copper Scroll were a modern forgery or a recent creation, its presence in the cave would be inexplicable. It was sealed in the cave for approximately 2,000 years, as evidenced by the oxidation patterns on the copper and the archaeological context of its discovery. This means it was created and hidden by the same community that produced the other Qumran scrolls during the same historical period. The Essenes, or whoever used these caves for storage, placed the Copper Scroll there deliberately, alongside religious texts they considered important enough to preserve. This contextual evidence strongly suggests they viewed the Copper Scroll as a genuine and valuable document, not a work of fiction or a collection of fairy tales. The question of why the scroll's treasures haven't been found has multiple possible answers beyond "they never existed." The most obvious is that they have been found, but not in modern times. The Romans were expert treasure hunters, routinely torturing prisoners to learn locations of hidden wealth. After the fall of Jerusalem, Roman soldiers and administrators had years to methodically search for concealed valuables. They had access to prisoners who might know about hiding operations, they controlled the territory completely, and they had strong incentives to recover as much as possible. If the Romans captured anyone involved in hiding the treasures, torture would have revealed locations. Over months or years, they could have recovered most or all of the caches described in the Copper Scroll. The only reason the scroll itself survived is that the Romans never found Cave 3, or if they did, they didn't recognize the value of a corroded copper sheet. This scenario explains why following the scroll today yields nothing. The treasures were real, the directions were accurate, but everything was recovered 2,000 years ago by people who had better information than we do. They could interrogate witnesses, recognize landmarks that still existed, and work from knowledge of pre-destruction Jerusalem. We're trying to solve a puzzle where the prize has already been claimed, working from incomplete information about a landscape that no longer exists. It's like searching for Easter eggs that were hidden and found decades ago. The map may be accurate, but the treasures are long gone. The Copper Scroll becomes a historical document recording a real operation that ultimately failed in its purpose. The treasures weren't preserved for future Jewish generations, but were captured by Rome instead. Another possibility is that environmental and urban changes have made recovery impossible, even if the treasures still exist. 2,000 years of earthquakes, erosion, construction, and geological processes have altered the landscape fundamentally. A cistern mentioned in the scroll might now be completely filled with sediment and debris, effectively sealing any treasure beneath meters of accumulated material. A cave or tomb might have collapsed, burying its contents under rockfall that would require major excavation to remove. A building site mentioned in the scroll might now be underneath a modern structure, physically inaccessible, without demolishing contemporary buildings. The treasures could be exactly where the scroll says they are, but getting to them would require resources and permissions that no individual or institution can muster. Jerusalem itself presents unique challenges. The old city has been continuously inhabited for 3,000 years, with each generation building on the ruins of the previous one. Archaeological excavation in such contexts is incredibly complex, requiring careful stratigraphic work to distinguish different periods and avoid damaging both ancient remains and modern structures. Many areas mentioned in the Copper Scroll are now beneath buildings, roads, or religious sites. The Temple Mount, where several scroll entries probably refer, is one of the most politically and religiously sensitive locations on Earth. No archaeological work can be done there without triggering international incidents. Even if someone definitively identified a treasure location on the Temple Mount, excavation would be politically impossible. The treasure might as well not exist if it cannot be accessed. The scroll's reference to an explanatory document that has never been found suggests yet another scenario. Perhaps the Copper Scroll was never meant to be used alone, but was part of a two-document system. The Copper Scroll provided the basic list of locations and quantities, while the explanatory scroll contained the contextual information needed to interpret the directions, which cubit measurement to use, how to identify landmarks, what the architectural terms specifically meant, perhaps even a master map showing how all the locations related to each other. Without the explanatory document, the Copper Scroll is like having a code book where every entry is encrypted. You can read the words, but you cannot understand the meaning. The people who created this system assumed both documents would be preserved together, or at least that both would survive independently and eventually be reunited. That reunion never happened, leaving us with half of a puzzle. Some researchers have speculated that the explanatory scroll might have been written on more perishable material, precisely because it was more sensitive. The Copper Scroll could be allowed to survive because even if enemies found it, they couldn't use it without the explanation. But the explanatory scroll, which would make the locations clear and accessible, needed to be kept more securely or destroyed if capture was imminent. This would be a clever security measure, ensuring that the information survived in a form that required insider knowledge to use. Unfortunately, it also means that 2,000 years later, the information might be forever beyond our reach. The explanation was either destroyed deliberately, lost accidentally, or perhaps found and used without anyone recognizing its connection to the copper scroll. The psychological dimension of this mystery cannot be ignored. The copper scroll represents hope preserved in the most permanent form ancient technology could achieve. Whoever created it believed deeply that the information was important enough to justify enormous expense and effort. They expected a future where their descendants or fellow believers would need this guide to recover what had been hidden. The document speaks to faith in continuity, a belief that despite catastrophe and chaos, some thread of connection would persist from their time to a future when recovery would be possible. That future never came, at least not in the way they imagined. The community that hid the treasures was destroyed, the knowledge was lost, and the scroll became an archaeological puzzle rather than a practical guide. In this sense, the copper scroll is less about gold and silver than about the eternal human desire to preserve something of value against an uncertain future, and the tragedy of how often such efforts fail. The possibility that Roman forces discovered and looted the copper scroll treasures deserves serious consideration when examining why nothing has been found in modern times. The Roman military machine that conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD was one of history's most efficient and systematic organizations. They didn't simply destroy cities and move on, they methodically extracted value from conquered territories, viewing warfare as much an economic enterprise as a military one. The siege of Jerusalem was expensive, requiring years of campaigning and tying up multiple legions that could have been deployed elsewhere. Rome expected conquered territories to pay for their own subjugation, and the wealth of Jerusalem's temple was well known throughout the ancient world. The Romans came not just to punish rebellion, but to profit from it, and they had sophisticated methods for ensuring they got every valuable item they could locate. Ancient sources provide chilling accounts of Roman interrogation methods after the fall of Jerusalem. Josephus describes how captured rebels were tortured to reveal hidden weapons, food stores, and treasure. The Romans understood that defenders would have attempted to hide valuables before the final assault, and they were determined to recover everything. Soldiers who discovered hidden wealth could claim a share, creating powerful incentives for thorough searching. Officers received percentages based on what their units recovered. This system meant that Roman forces spent months systematically searching Jerusalem and the surrounding area, probing walls, excavating suspicious locations, and interrogating prisoners about possible hiding places. Any priest or community member who knew about the treasure distribution would have been a prime target for torture. The Romans had considerable advantages in this treasure hunt. First, they controlled the territory completely after 70 AD. There was no resistance, no interference, just methodical searching backed by military power. Second, they could interrogate survivors who had direct knowledge of pre-war Jerusalem. While the priestly leadership was likely killed, lower-ranking temple personnel, community members, and others who might have witnessed treasure-hiding operations probably survived as slaves or prisoners. Under torture, people reveal secrets, and the Romans were skilled at extractive interrogation. Third, they had time. The Roman presence in Judea lasted decades after the war, providing ample opportunity to follow leads and investigate rumors. Unlike modern treasure hunters who work with fragmentary historical records, the Romans were gathering information from living witnesses who had seen the locations with their own eyes. The Arch of Titus in Rome provides tangible evidence of what the Romans extracted from Jerusalem. The carved reliefs show legionaries carrying the temple menorah, the golden table of showbread, and silver trumpets through Rome during Titus's triumph in 71 AD. These were the ceremonial objects from the temple's inner sanctuary, items that would have been among the most difficult to steal given their location and the defenders' determination to protect them. If the Romans managed to seize these sacrosanct objects from the temple's heart, they certainly would have pursued rumors of additional treasures hidden elsewhere. The triumph parade displayed only the most symbolically important items, things that would impress the Roman crowds and demonstrate the completeness of their victory. The bulk gold and silver mentioned in the copper scroll, less visually impressive but far more valuable financially, would have been quietly deposited in the imperial treasury. One particularly suggestive piece of evidence is that Roman writers mention treasure hunting operations in Judea, but frustratingly provide few details. Tacitus and Cassius Dio both reference continued Roman interest in discovering hidden Jewish wealth years after the war ended. This suggests the Romans knew or suspected that significant amounts had been concealed and were actively searching for it. They wouldn't have invested resources in these searches unless they had solid intelligence suggesting treasures existed. Likely this intelligence came from interrogated prisoners who knew about hiding operations but perhaps didn't know specific locations, or knew locations but couldn't communicate them clearly enough for Romans unfamiliar with pre-war Jerusalem to understand. The searches eventually ceased, either because the Romans found what they were looking for or because they concluded that further searching was unproductive. If the Romans did recover the copper scroll treasures, this would explain several mysteries. It accounts for why modern archaeological surveys and excavations have found nothing matching the scroll's descriptions despite decades of searching. The treasures existed and the scroll was accurate, but everything was removed 2,000 years ago. It explains why the scroll itself survived. The Romans found it, but didn't recognize its value or couldn't read it. A corroded piece of copper with punched Hebrew letters would not have been obviously valuable to Roman soldiers. They might have examined it briefly and discarded it as worthless, or perhaps they never entered Cave 3 at all. The cave system at Qumran was extensive and easy to overlook if you didn't know where to look. Roman forces were thorough, but not omniscient. This theory also provides a plausible timeline for treasure recovery. The Romans would have had maximum effectiveness in the immediate aftermath of the siege, when survivors with direct knowledge were available for questioning. Within 5 to 10 years of 70 AD, they could have identified and excavated most locations mentioned in the scroll. By the time a generation had passed, the opportunities would have diminished. People with first-hand knowledge died, memories faded, and the landscape changed enough that even accurate descriptions became harder to follow. If recovery operations took place between 70 and 100 AD, we would expect little surviving documentary evidence. These were routine military administration activities, not significant enough to merit detailed historical records. The Romans kept careful accounts of major military expenditures and conquests, but didn't necessarily document every treasure recovery operation conducted by garrison troops. However, this scenario faces challenges. If the Romans successfully recovered enormous quantities of gold and silver from hidden caches around Jerusalem, we might expect some reflection of this in imperial finances or historical accounts. The Roman treasury records from this period are fragmentary, but major influxes of wealth typically left traces in the form of building projects, military bonuses, or references in literature. After the fall of Jerusalem, Rome certainly experienced an infusion of wealth from Judea, but the amounts mentioned seem consistent with looting the temple and city directly, not with discovering additional hidden treasures equivalent to 26 tons of gold. Unless the discoveries were made gradually over many years and integrated into regular tax revenues rather than recorded as extraordinary finds, they should have been more visible in the historical record. Another problem is that Roman treasure hunting depended on information from prisoners and survivors. But if the copper scroll represented a successful hiding operation, then by definition very few people knew about it. The whole point of creating a durable record on copper was that oral transmission might fail, that the knowledge might be lost if key individuals died. If only a handful of priests knew the full scope of the treasure distribution and they died in the siege without being captured, the Romans would have had no one to interrogate. They might have recovered some individual caches based on chance discoveries or information from lower-level participants who knew about 1 or 2 locations, but the systematic recovery of all 64 sites would have been impossible without the scroll itself or testimony from someone who had read it and memorized it. The survival of the copper scroll in its hiding place suggests such testimony was never given. A more nuanced version of the Roman recovery theory suggests partial success. Perhaps the Romans found some treasures, but not all. Locations within or immediately adjacent to Jerusalem would have been most vulnerable to Roman searching. These were areas the legions controlled completely, where they could dig extensively without hindrance. Caches in the city itself, under buildings or in cisterns within the walls, would have been relatively easy to locate given enough time and prisoner interrogation. But treasures hidden in the wilderness, in remote caves or tombs far from settlements, would have been much harder to find. The Romans might have recovered half or two-thirds of what was hidden, leaving scattered remnants in locations they never discovered. This would explain both the absence of finds today, most was recovered anciently, and the lack of dramatic evidence in Roman records. The amounts recovered were significant but not overwhelming. If we accept that some treasures might still exist because Romans couldn't find them all, we face the question of why no one has found them in the subsequent 2,000 years. The answer involves a combination of factors related to knowledge, access, and change. The knowledge required to interpret the scroll was lost when the generation that created it died. Even if someone found the scroll in antiquity, they would have faced the same interpretive challenges we face today, trying to match ancient place names to current geography, understanding obsolete measurements, and identifying landmarks that no longer existed. Without oral tradition or additional documentation to provide context, the scroll would have been as cryptic to ancient readers as it is to modern ones. Access is another crucial factor. Many locations mentioned in the scroll are in areas that have been difficult to access for long periods of history. During the Byzantine and early Islamic periods, much of the Judean wilderness was essentially abandoned, inhabited only by small numbers of monks and hermits. The ruins of Qumran and surrounding areas were known but not systematically explored. Without modern archaeological techniques and interests, ancient or medieval travelers wouldn't have had reason to conduct extensive excavations in these remote locations. Later, during the Ottoman period, the region was controlled by authorities who prohibited unauthorized digging, especially near religious sites. Anyone attempting to conduct treasure hunting operations would have risked severe penalties. The first real opportunity for systematic archaeological exploration came only in the 19th and 20th centuries, and even then, political considerations limited what could be done. The cumulative environmental changes over 2 millennia cannot be overstated. Earthquakes have altered the landscape repeatedly. The Dead Sea shore has shifted significantly, with water levels fluctuating by dozens of meters over the centuries. Areas that were accessible in the 1st century might now be underwater or buried under sediment. Conversely, areas that were underwater then might now be exposed, but so altered that ancient descriptions no longer apply. Human construction has been equally transformative. Jerusalem has been rebuilt multiple times, each iteration burying the previous city under new foundations and structures. Identifying where ancient buildings stood is often impossible without extensive archaeological excavation, and even then attributions are tentative. A treasure hidden under the steps of the Eastern Gate cannot be found if we cannot determine with certainty where the Eastern Gate was located. The fate of the explanatory scroll mentioned in the Copper Scroll's final line is perhaps the key to understanding why Roman treasure recovery may have been incomplete. If this document existed and fell into Roman hands, they would have had a significant advantage in locating the treasures. But if it was successfully hidden separately and never recovered, the Romans would have been working from interrogation testimony alone, necessarily incomplete and potentially unreliable. Torture produces desperate people willing to say anything to stop the pain, leading to much false information mixed with truth. Roman forces might have followed dozens of false leads for every genuine treasure location they discovered. This inefficiency would have limited their success rate and eventually led to abandoning the search as unproductive. The explanatory scroll's fate thus determines whether the treasures could have been systematically recovered or remained fundamentally elusive, even to the Romans. One tantalizing piece of circumstantial evidence suggests Roman awareness of the treasures without complete recovery. Several Roman writers mention persistent legends among Jews about hidden temple wealth that would be revealed in Messianic times. These references appear in texts written decades or even centuries after the fall of Jerusalem, suggesting the legends remained alive in Jewish communities despite the Roman conquest. Would such legends persist if the Romans had demonstrably recovered everything? The continuation of treasure traditions implies that at least some portion of what was hidden remained undiscovered, fueling hope and speculation that continues to the present day. The legends transformed from practical information about real caches into mythical accounts of messianic revelation, but the core belief in hidden wealth survived because it was never definitively disproven by Roman recovery operations. The question of whether Romans found the treasures ultimately cannot be answered with certainty based on available evidence. We know they looked, we know they had methods and motivations to search thoroughly, and we know they recovered substantial wealth from Jerusalem. But whether they found the specific caches described in the Copper Scroll remains unknown. The scroll itself survived, which suggests at least that the Romans didn't find everything related to the treasure distribution. If they had captured someone who revealed the scroll's existence and location, they would surely have retrieved it as confirmation of what they'd found. Its survival in Cave 3 implies that this particular piece of the puzzle eluded them, and if the scroll eluded them, perhaps some or all of the treasures did as well. The choice to inscribe the Copper Scroll on metal rather than parchment or papyrus is perhaps the single most revealing decision the ancient creators made, and understanding their reasoning requires examining what copper meant in the first-century Mediterranean world. Copper was not a cheap or readily available material for writing. Unlike parchment, which could be produced from animal skins through established processes in any region with livestock, or papyrus, which grew abundantly in Egypt and was traded throughout the ancient world, copper required mining, smelting, and extensive metalworking to produce sheets thin enough for inscription. The metal had significant intrinsic value. Pure copper could be melted down and reused for coins, tools, decorative objects, or architectural elements. Using copper for writing was roughly equivalent to printing modern documents on sheets of silver. Technically possible, but economically absurd unless the content justified the expense. The ancient world had established hierarchies of writing materials that reflected the perceived importance of texts. Everyday documents, receipts, letters, and temporary records were written on pottery shards called ostraca, essentially free materials repurposed from broken vessels. More important documents used papyrus, relatively affordable and suitable for texts expected to last years or decades. Parchment was reserved for valuable works, religious texts, legal documents, and literary compositions that needed to survive for generations. But even parchment had limitations. It could burn, rot, be eaten by insects, or disintegrate if improperly stored. For texts requiring absolute permanence, ancient scribes turned to stone or metal. Stone inscriptions commemorated public monuments, recorded laws, and marked important events, but stone was immobile and difficult to work. Metal, specifically bronze or copper, offered permanence with portability, making it ideal for messages intended to survive any catastrophe and be retrievable when needed. Historical examples of metal documents from antiquity are rare but significant. The Romans occasionally inscribed important laws and decrees on bronze tablets, particularly those intended to be displayed publicly and preserved indefinitely. The 12 Tables, Rome's foundational legal code, were written on bronze. Treaties between states were sometimes recorded on metal to ensure both parties had durable copies that couldn't be easily altered or destroyed. But these were official state documents created by wealthy institutions with resources to spare. For a private group or religious community to choose copper for a document suggests they considered it as important as any state law or international treaty, critical information that had to survive no matter what. The expense involved was justified by the stakes. If this information was lost, something irreplaceable would be gone forever. The specific technique used to inscribe the Copper Scroll reveals additional insights. Rather than engraving from the front, which was the standard method for metal inscriptions, the scribe punched letters from the back, creating raised text on the front surface. This technique was more difficult and time-consuming than direct engraving, requiring the copper to be supported on a yielding surface, while each letter was carefully formed with multiple strikes of a small punch. Why choose this laborious method? One possibility is that punching was less likely to crack the thin copper sheets than engraving would have been. Engraving removes material, potentially weakening the metal, while punching displaces material without removing it, maintaining structural integrity. Another possibility is that raised letters were more legible, especially if the copper oxidized over time. The relief would remain readable even if surface detail was lost to corrosion, exactly what happened during the scroll's 2,000-year burial. The decision to use copper also speaks to expectations about storage conditions. Parchment scrolls found at Qumran were preserved in sealed ceramic jars that protected them from moisture and environmental damage. The copper scroll was not stored in a jar, it was simply placed in the cave, apparently confident that the material itself would survive without special protection. This confidence proved justified. The copper oxidized but remained structurally sound and legible after 2 millennia. The creators understood the material properties of copper. They knew it would corrode, but that oxidation would protect the metal beneath, that the inscription would remain readable, and that the scroll could be recovered and read even after centuries or millennia of burial. This level of metallurgical sophistication suggests the involvement of craftsmen or engineers who understood metal preservation, not simply religious scribes working with unfamiliar materials. But the copper choice carries an inherent risk that parchment does not. Metal is valuable and tempting to thieves or scavengers. A copper scroll could be melted down for its metal content, destroying the inscription to recover a few coins' worth of raw material. Parchment has no such resale value once written on, making it safer from casual destruction. The creators of the copper scroll must have weighed this risk and decided that the permanence benefits outweighed the theft danger. Perhaps they believed the scroll would be hidden so securely that opportunistic thieves would never find it, that only those specifically searching for it with knowledge of its location would be able to recover it. This proved partially correct. The scroll survived, but it also suggests the creators never anticipated their message remaining hidden for 2,000 years. They expected recovery within a generation or two at most, when the information would still be relevant and usable. The financial investment in creating the copper scroll can be roughly estimated based on ancient prices preserved in various sources. Copper suitable for writing would have cost several times its weight in grain, making the approximately 10 kilograms of copper used in the scroll worth perhaps several months of an average worker's wages. The specialized labor to hammer it thin, anneal it properly, and prepare it for inscription would have added considerable cost. The scribe's time, potentially hundreds of hours of careful work punching letters, represented another major expense. Including all costs, creating the copper scroll probably consumed resources equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn in a year or more. This was not a trivial undertaking, but a major project requiring institutional backing and serious commitment. Only wealthy institutions could afford such an investment, which points again toward the Jerusalem Temple as the likely sponsor. A small community like Qumran, while capable of producing parchment scrolls through their own labor, would have struggled to finance a copper document without external support. The temple treasury, however, routinely handled such sums and would have considered the cost negligible if the stakes were high enough. If the scroll documented the locations of treasures worth millions in modern terms, spending the equivalent of $20,000 or $30,000 on creating a permanent record would be an obvious and prudent investment. The disproportion between the document's cost and the wealth it described actually argues for authenticity. No one would spend lavishly on copper to record fictional treasures, but spending lavishly to protect real wealth makes perfect sense. The symbolic significance of copper in ancient Jewish tradition adds another dimension to understanding the material choice. Copper and bronze figured prominently in temple furnishings and ritual objects. The great bronze altar in the temple courtyard, the bronze sea, various vessels and instruments were all made from copper alloys. While these ceremonial objects were typically bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, rather than pure copper, The metal family had sacred associations in Jewish religious practice. Using copper for a document related to temple treasures may have carried ritual significance beyond its practical properties. The scroll became not just a record, but a sacred object in its own right, made from temple-appropriate materials and treated with corresponding reverence. This might explain why it was preserved with religious scrolls in the Qumran caves rather than stored separately as a purely administrative document. Yet this raises a puzzling contradiction. If the copper scroll was considered sacred or religiously significant, why does it contain no religious language whatsoever? Every other scroll from Qumran that can be considered sacred includes prayers, blessings, references to God, or theological content. The copper scroll is utterly secular in its language, focused entirely on physical locations and material quantities. This suggests that whatever reverence surrounded the scroll stemmed from its practical importance rather than spiritual content. It was sacred because of what it protected: the community's future survival and ability to recover its resources, not because of any inherent religious meaning in the text itself. The copper material honored the scroll's critical function, while the content remained uncompromisingly practical. The question of whether multiple copper scrolls existed deserves consideration. The final line of the scroll explicitly mentions another copy with additional explanation. If the creators went to the expense and effort of making one copper scroll, they might have made several to ensure redundancy. Multiple copies distributed to different secure locations would guard against the loss of any single document. This was standard practice for important ancient records. Treaties and laws were often duplicated and deposited in multiple temples or archives. The copper scroll found in Cave 3 might be one of 2, 3, or even more copies, each hidden in different locations known to different trusted individuals. If so, there could be other copper scrolls still buried and undiscovered, waiting in caves or chambers that archaeologists haven't yet explored. The vast Judean wilderness contains thousands of potential hiding places that have never been systematically surveyed. Alternatively, the reference to another document might mean a different type of record entirely. Perhaps the master copy was inscribed on copper and hidden in a primary location, while secondary copies were made on parchment for actual use by those who needed to access the information regularly. The copper versions were backups, intended to survive if everything else was destroyed, while parchment versions were the working documents. This would explain why we have only copper scroll. The parchment copies were used and eventually destroyed or lost, while the copper backup survived precisely because it was put away safely and never retrieved. The explanation mentioned might have been a detailed parchment document kept separate, providing the context and keys needed to interpret the copper scroll's terse entries. The physical difficulty of reading the copper scroll may itself have been a deliberate security feature. Even if someone found the scroll, the effort required to open and read it provided a barrier against casual discovery and exploitation. The scroll couldn't be quickly unrolled and read like parchment. It required careful cutting and examination, a process that would be difficult to do secretly or in haste. This gave the scroll's intended recipients an advantage. They would know it existed, know where to find it, and have the time and resources to properly open and study it. Enemies or opportunistic looters who stumbled upon it might not recognize its value or might lack the technical means to access the information without destroying it. The copper medium thus served as both preservation and protection, ensuring the message survived while making it difficult for unauthorized parties to exploit. Modern attempts to replicate the copper scroll's creation have provided insights into the skill required. Experimental archaeologists working with copper sheets of similar thickness have found that producing legible text by punching from the back demands considerable practice and expertise. The metal must be properly annealed to prevent cracking, the punching surface must have the right amount of give to allow letter formation without tearing the copper, and the punching force must be carefully controlled to create consistent letter depth. Even experienced metalworkers struggle to match the quality of the original scroll's inscription. This suggests the ancient scribe had either extensive prior experience with similar work or underwent considerable training specifically for this project. The technical quality of the inscription argues for institutional support and professional execution rather than a desperate improvisation during a crisis. The survival of the copper scroll in readable condition after 2,000 years validates the creator's choice of material, but also highlights how differently ancient and modern people thought about information preservation. Today, we store critical data on redundant digital systems with backup power supplies and disaster recovery protocols, assuming that active maintenance will keep information accessible. The creators of the copper scroll had no such options. They needed passive preservation, a medium that would survive without any maintenance whatsoever for an unknown period until circumstances allowed recovery. Copper met this requirement perfectly. No power source needed, no environmental controls required, just material properties that would protect the inscription through pure chemistry and physics. In that sense, copper was the ultimate backup medium, more reliable than any modern technology because it required nothing but time to prove its worth. The attempts to locate treasures based on the copper scroll represent some of the most fascinating episodes in archaeological history, combining scholarly research with adventurous treasure hunting and inevitably ending in frustration. Each expedition approached the problem with different methodologies, technologies, and assumptions, yet all ultimately failed to produce the golden validation that would prove the scroll's authenticity beyond doubt. These failures are instructive, revealing not just the difficulties of following ancient directions, but also the complex web of political, religious, and practical obstacles that surround any attempt to excavate in the historically charged landscape of the Holy Land. Understanding why these expeditions failed helps illuminate both the scroll's mysteries and the broader challenges of archaeological work in contested territories. John Allegro's 1960 expedition remains the most ambitious and controversial attempt to find the copper scroll treasures. Allegro was uniquely positioned for the task, having been part of the original team that translated the Dead Sea Scrolls, and having access to photographs and transcriptions before most scholars even knew the copper scroll existed. He was convinced from the moment he first examined the text that it described real treasures rather than folklore or legend. His academic colleagues were skeptical, viewing his treasure-hunting enthusiasm as unseemly and unscholarly, but Allegro pressed ahead with characteristic determination. He secured funding from British sources, obtained permission from Jordanian authorities who controlled the West Bank and Qumran area at that time, and assembled a team of archaeologists and workers ready to dig at multiple sites around the Dead Sea. Allegro's strategy was to focus on locations near Qumran that seemed to match geographical references in the scroll. He reasoned that the scroll's creators would have hidden treasures relatively close to their community in areas they knew intimately and could access without attracting attention. The Judean wilderness around Qumran was honeycombed with caves, wadis, and ruins that could correspond to the scroll's descriptions. Allegro identified several promising sites based on his interpretation of the Hebrew text and his knowledge of the local geography. His team excavated at multiple locations over several months, carefully documenting everything they found. They uncovered pottery sherds, coins from various periods, fragments of other scrolls, and evidence of ancient habitation. But they found no gold, no silver, no vessels full of precious metals as described in the copper scroll. Each excavation yielded interesting archaeological data, but not treasure. The professional fallout from Allegro's expedition was severe. His academic peers, already skeptical of his treasure-hunting project, saw the failure as confirmation that the copper scroll was not meant to be taken literally. Father Roland Deveau, who led the Qumran excavations and was Allegro's nominal superior, publicly criticized the expedition as a waste of resources that had damaged the scroll's scholarly reputation. Other members of the translation team distanced themselves from Allegro's interpretations. The perception developed that anyone who took the copper scroll seriously as a treasure map was not a serious scholar, but a naive adventurer chasing fairy tales. This stigma has persisted, making it professionally risky for archaeologists to advocate for further treasure-seeking expeditions based on the scroll. Allegro's career suffered, though he continued to insist until his death that the treasures were real and that he had simply searched in the wrong places or misinterpreted some crucial detail. Allegro's actual findings, viewed objectively, were less conclusive than either his critics or supporters acknowledged. He found no treasure, but he also didn't exhaustively search every possible location. The Judean wilderness is vast, and the scroll mentions 64 separate hiding places across a wide geographical area. Allegro's expedition focused on a small subset of these locations, those he could access with his limited time and resources. Negative results at 5 or 10 sites don't prove that nothing exists at the other 50-plus locations. The scroll could still be accurate overall, even if Allegro's specific site identifications were incorrect. But in the court of academic opinion, the absence of positive findings was treated as evidence of absence, confirming the prevailing view that the scroll was fictional or folkloric rather than a genuine treasure map. The next major expedition came nearly 3 decades later, led by Vendell Jones, an American researcher with a very different background from Allegro's academic credentials. Jones was a former Baptist minister who became fascinated with Jewish history and traditions, eventually converting to Noahidism, a non-Jewish religious movement based on Jewish law. His interest in the Copper Scroll was both scholarly and mystical. He believed that finding temple treasures would have spiritual significance and might even herald messianic times. This religious dimension to his search made mainstream archaeologists even more dismissive than they had been with Allegro. But Jones brought resources and determination that academic researchers often lacked. He could raise funds from private donors excited by the treasure-hunting narrative, and he was willing to spend years working in the Judean Desert, pursuing a goal that professional archaeologists considered quixotic. Jones's most significant claim came in 1988 when his team excavated a cave near Qumran and discovered a clay jar containing a reddish powder. Jones sent samples to laboratories for analysis, and the results showed compounds consistent with ancient incense, including botanicals mentioned in biblical descriptions of temple incense recipes. Jones interpreted this as validation of the Copper Scroll, which specifically mentions a vessel containing incense offerings, at a location that Jones believed corresponded to where he was digging. He announced that he had found temple treasures exactly as the scroll described, even if they weren't the gold and silver everyone expected. The media attention was considerable, with news outlets running stories about Dead Sea Scroll treasures being discovered after 2,000 years. Jones became something of a celebrity in certain circles, appearing on television and giving lectures about his discoveries. But the academic response was withering. Skeptics pointed out that finding ancient incense near Qumran, a site occupied for generations by a Jewish religious community, was not particularly surprising. The Essenes used incense in their own rituals, and the presence of aromatic substances didn't prove any connection to the temple or to the Copper Scroll specifically. Jones's identification of the site with a scroll location was questioned. The geographical correspondence seemed forced and based on very liberal interpretation of the scroll's vague directions. The chemical analysis of the incense, while interesting, couldn't definitively date the material or prove it came from temple stores rather than local Essene production. Jones's claim to have found Copper Scroll treasures was widely rejected as overreach, a case of finding something interesting and retrofitting it into the narrative he wanted to tell. Jones continued searching for years, conducting additional excavations and making further claims about discovering temple oil and other materials. Each announcement was met with the same pattern: initial media excitement, followed by scholarly skepticism and eventual dismissal. Jones never found the massive quantities of gold and silver that would be indisputable proof of the scroll's accuracy. His defenders argued that sacred substances like incense and anointing oil were themselves valuable treasures, that the scroll shouldn't be read as listing only monetary wealth. But critics countered that without the gold and silver explicitly mentioned in dozens of scroll entries, Jones's finds were interesting archaeological discoveries, but not validation of the Copper Scroll as a treasure map. When Jones died in 2010, he remained convinced he had found real temple treasures, but he had not convinced the broader scholarly community or located anything that definitively proved the scroll's contents were real. The most technologically sophisticated analysis of the Copper Scroll came from Jim Barfield, a retired arson investigator from Oklahoma who brought a criminal investigator's mindset to the ancient mystery. Barfield had no formal training in archaeology or ancient languages, but he had decades of experience analyzing crime scenes, following complex trails of evidence, and developing theories based on fragmentary information. When he became interested in the Copper Scroll in the early 2000s, he approached it not as an ancient text requiring scholarly interpretation, but as a series of clues in a cold case investigation. He applied geographic profiling techniques, statistical analysis, and pattern recognition methods that had proven useful in his law enforcement career. His fresh perspective, unburdened by archaeological conventions and academic assumptions, allowed him to see patterns that specialists might have overlooked. Barfield spent years studying not just the Copper Scroll, but also biblical texts, historical documents, and archaeological reports about Jerusalem and its environs. He used geographic information system software to map ancient locations onto modern terrain, looking for sites that could correspond to the scroll's descriptions. He paid particular attention to what he called clusters of references, multiple scroll entries that seemed to describe locations in close proximity to each other. Barfield theorized that if several treasures were hidden in one general area, that area was likely significant in 1st century Jerusalem, perhaps near the Temple Mount or along major processional routes. By 2007, he had identified what he considered 9 high-probability locations where Copper Scroll treasures might be found. Several were in the Old City of Jerusalem, others near the City of David Archaeological Park, and a few in more remote wilderness areas. Barfield's methodology was rigorous by investigative standards, if unconventional by archaeological ones. He cross-referenced scroll locations with mentions of similar places in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and other prophetic books that described hiding treasures before the Babylonian conquest. He reasoned that good hiding places would be reused across generations, that locations secure enough for treasures in 586 BC would still be secure in 70 AD. He analyzed the scroll's language for patterns, noting which architectural terms appeared together and what that might reveal about the types of structures being described. He even considered psychological factors. Where would ancient priests feel comfortable hiding sacred objects? What kinds of locations would they avoid for ritual purity reasons? This holistic approach produced a list of candidate sites that Barfield believed had a high probability of actually containing treasures if the scroll was genuine. The challenge Barfield faced was that identifying locations is only the first step. Excavation requires permissions that are extraordinarily difficult to obtain in Jerusalem. The Old City is perhaps the most archaeologically sensitive location on Earth, sacred to 3 major religions and claimed by multiple political entities. Any excavation requires approval from Israeli authorities, coordination with religious authorities from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities, and navigation of international politics surrounding Jerusalem's status. Barfield presented his findings to the Israel Antiquities Authority, hoping to obtain permission at least to conduct non-invasive surveys using ground-penetrating radar or other remote sensing technologies. He was politely received, but ultimately denied permission. The political risks were simply too high. Any discovery related to the temple or ancient Jewish treasures would inevitably trigger religious and nationalist responses that the Israeli government preferred to avoid. Barfield's case illustrates a fundamental problem with Copper Scroll research. We may have the capability to find the treasures, but lack the political will to look. Modern technology could, in theory, locate metal objects buried in the locations Barfield and others have identified. Ground-penetrating radar can detect voids and density anomalies underground. Magnetometry can identify ferrous materials. Even without excavation, surveys could confirm or rule out the presence of large quantities of metal in suspected locations. But conducting such surveys in the Old City, on the Temple Mount, or even in some West Bank locations requires permissions that bridge political and religious divides. No Israeli government wants to deal with the fallout if temple treasures are found under a mosque or in an area claimed by Palestinians. No Palestinian authority wants to facilitate an Israeli search for artifacts that would strengthen Jewish historical claims to the land. The problem extends beyond Jerusalem to seemingly less sensitive areas around the Dead Sea. Even at Qumran itself, now securely within Israeli-controlled territory and already extensively excavated, conducting new digs specifically to search for Copper Scroll treasures faces bureaucratic obstacles. The Israel Antiquities Authority has limited budgets and must prioritize excavations that promise clear scholarly benefits over speculative treasure hunts. Academic archaeologists compete for permits based on research questions and potential contributions to knowledge. A proposal to dig at Qumran looking for gold based on the copper scroll would be evaluated alongside proposals for systematic excavations of important sites throughout the country. In this competitive environment, treasure hunting rarely wins approval, regardless of the evidence supporting it. There have been smaller, less publicized attempts by various individuals and groups to search for copper scroll treasures over the decades. Some obtained permissions for legitimate archaeological work and kept their eyes open for anything matching scroll descriptions. Others worked in gray areas, conducting limited probes without official approval in remote locations where they were unlikely to be noticed. A few certainly engaged in outright illegal excavation, though by definition we know little about such activities. None of these efforts has produced verified finds, or if they have, the finders chose not to report them. This creates an information problem. Absence of reported discoveries doesn't mean absence of actual discoveries, only absence of publicly acknowledged ones. Someone who found a cache of ancient gold might very well keep quiet and gradually liquidate their find through black market channels rather than surrendering it to authorities. The application of modern technology to the copper scroll mystery represents both tremendous promise and frustrating limitation, showcasing how far archaeological science has advanced while simultaneously revealing the enduring power of political and practical constraints. In theory, 21st century tools should make finding the scroll's treasures easier than ever before. Ground-penetrating radar can detect underground voids and anomalies to depths of several meters without disturbing the soil. Magnetometry identifies ferrous metals and can map subsurface features invisible from the surface. LiDAR scanning creates detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain, revealing ancient structures hidden under vegetation or modern development. Satellite imagery with multispectral analysis can identify archaeological sites based on subtle differences in soil chemistry and plant growth patterns. Chemical analysis of soil samples can detect traces of metals even if the objects themselves have been removed. Each of these technologies offers capabilities that John Allegro could only have dreamed of in 1960. Geographic information systems have revolutionized how researchers approach the copper scroll's geographical puzzle. Modern GIS software can overlay historical maps, archaeological surveys, and ancient texts onto current satellite imagery, allowing scholars to visualize how ancient Jerusalem might have corresponded to the modern city. Researchers can input the scroll's place names and architectural references, then use algorithms to identify candidate locations based on multiple criteria simultaneously. This computational approach can process far more data than any individual scholar examining maps and texts manually, potentially identifying patterns and connections that would otherwise remain hidden. Jim Barfield's work demonstrated this potential, using GIS analysis to narrow the field of possible locations from hundreds of sites to a manageable shortlist that could theoretically be investigated systematically. Artificial intelligence and machine learning offer even more sophisticated analytical possibilities. Natural language processing algorithms can analyze the Copper Scroll's Hebrew text alongside thousands of other ancient documents, identifying linguistic patterns and semantic relationships that illuminate obscure terms and ambiguous phrases. Machine learning models trained on archaeological data from excavated sites can predict where similar features might exist based on geographical and geological characteristics. Computer vision systems can examine photographs and scans of the scroll itself, potentially revealing details invisible to human observers, traces of additional text, corrections, or markings that provide interpretive clues. These AI tools are particularly valuable for working with damaged or partially illegible texts, using probabilistic reconstruction to suggest what missing letters or words might have been based on context and linguistic patterns. Yet all these technological capabilities run headlong into intractable practical obstacles when applied to the Copper Scroll problem. The most sophisticated ground-penetrating radar system in the world is useless if you cannot obtain permission to bring it onto the sites you want to survey. Israeli authorities are understandably cautious about authorizing equipment-intensive operations in sensitive locations, particularly when those operations are explicitly searching for treasures that could have enormous political and religious implications. The Temple Mount, where several Copper Scroll locations probably refer, is effectively off-limits to any archaeological investigation. The site is controlled by the Islamic Waqf, which prohibits excavation and severely restricts even non-invasive surveys. Any attempt to scan for buried treasures there would trigger international incidents and potentially violence. Technology cannot overcome politics, and politics in Jerusalem is perhaps the most complex anywhere on Earth. Even in less obviously sensitive locations, bureaucratic and logistical challenges constrain technological applications. Operating advanced scanning equipment requires permits, transportation of specialized gear, technical expertise, and often substantial time on site to collect meaningful data. Ground-penetrating radar surveys are not simply a matter of walking around with a device for an hour. They require systematic grid coverage, repeated passes with different frequency settings, careful documentation, and subsequent analysis of the resulting data. All of this takes days or weeks and generates activity that attracts attention. In areas with security concerns, or where archaeological work is politically charged, such operations become complicated quickly. Researchers must balance the scientific benefits of thorough surveying against the risks of attracting unwanted attention or triggering opposition from parties who prefer that nothing be found. The interpretation of technological survey results presents its own challenges. Ground-penetrating radar can detect anomalies underground, but determining what those anomalies represent requires expertise and often ground truthing through excavation. A void detected at the right depth in a promising location might be an ancient cistern containing treasure, or it might be a natural cave, a modern utility tunnel, or an archaeological feature completely unrelated to the Copper Scroll. The technology can tell you something is there, but cannot definitively identify what it is without physical investigation. This limitation means that even if surveys identify promising targets, excavation is still necessary to confirm findings. And excavation, unlike remote sensing, permanently alters the site and requires extensive permissions that may be impossible to obtain. Linguistic analysis using computational tools has advanced understanding of the Copper Scroll's text, but has not resolved its fundamental ambiguities. Scholars have used statistical analysis to study the scroll's vocabulary, identifying patterns in how terms are used, and comparing its language to other Hebrew texts from the same period. This work has clarified some previously uncertain translations and provided insights into the scroll's authorship and possible date of composition. But computers cannot resolve ambiguities that arise from lost cultural context rather than linguistic complexity. When the scroll mentions the monument at Beth Hakerem, no amount of computational analysis can tell us which specific structure is meant if multiple monuments existed in that location. The problem is not linguistic, but historical and geographical, requiring knowledge that was common in the 1st century, but is now lost. Digital reconstruction of ancient Jerusalem offers another promising technological approach. Archaeologists and computer scientists have created detailed three-dimensional models of the Second Temple period city based on excavation data, historical sources, and architectural analysis. These virtual reconstructions allow researchers to walk through ancient Jerusalem, viewing the city as it might have appeared before the Roman destruction. By referencing the Copper Scroll's directions within these models, researchers can test whether proposed locations make sense in the context of the ancient urban layout. If the scroll says to go eastward from the eastern gate, the model can show what would have been visible in that direction, what architectural features existed, and where measured distances would lead. This virtual archaeology provides insights impossible to gain from studying ruins alone, since the ruins no longer show the relationships between structures that the scroll's directions assume. However, digital reconstructions are only as good as the data underlying them, and our knowledge of 1st century Jerusalem remains incomplete. Large sections of the ancient city are inaccessible to excavation, buried under modern buildings, or located in areas where political considerations prevent archaeological work. Reconstructions must rely on educated guesses for these areas, interpolating between known sites and using general principles of ancient urban planning to fill gaps. When the copper scroll references locations in poorly understood parts of the city, even the best digital models cannot provide definitive answers. The reconstructions are hypotheses rendered in pixels, useful for testing ideas, but not substitutes for actual knowledge of what existed where. Every uncertainty in the archaeological record translates into uncertainty in the virtual model, which then propagates through any analysis based on that model. Chemical analysis of soils and sediments represents another technological frontier with potential application to copper scroll research. Precious metals leave chemical signatures in surrounding soil even if the objects themselves are removed. Copper, silver, and gold ions leach into groundwater and bind to soil particles, creating detectable traces that can persist for centuries or millennia. If treasures described in the scroll were buried at a specific location and then removed, chemical analysis might detect residual metal signatures indicating that metal objects were once present. This technique has been used successfully at other archaeological sites to identify ancient metalworking areas or burial sites that contained metal grave goods subsequently looted. Applying it to copper scroll locations could potentially distinguish between sites where no treasure ever existed and sites where treasure was present but has been removed. The challenge with chemical analysis is obtaining samples from the right locations. Soil chemistry varies dramatically over small distances based on geology, hydrology, and human activity. To meaningfully test for ancient metal signatures, researchers need samples from precisely where the scroll indicates treasures were buried. But if we cannot identify those locations with certainty, we cannot collect meaningful samples. Random sampling across large areas might miss the crucial spots entirely. And even if samples show metal signatures, distinguishing ancient from modern contamination requires sophisticated analysis. Modern urban environments contain metal traces from countless sources: plumbing, construction materials, discarded objects, and industrial pollution. Isolating ancient signatures from this background noise is technically possible, but requires extensive sampling and careful statistical analysis that may be impractical in many situations. Despite all these technological capabilities, the fundamental challenge remains unchanged from John Allegro's time. The copper scroll assumes knowledge its readers no longer possess, familiarity with a city that no longer exists, understanding of terms whose meanings have been lost, and ability to recognize landmarks that have vanished. Technology can help us search more efficiently once we know where to look, but it cannot solve the interpretation problem that makes knowing where to look so difficult. Until someone discovers the explanatory scroll mentioned in the copper scroll's final line, or until archaeological work uncovers completely new information about 1st century Jerusalem's layout and landmarks, the scroll's directions will remain tantalizingly specific yet frustratingly useless. We have the tools to verify the treasure's presence if we could identify the locations, but identifying the locations requires information that technology alone cannot provide. After 7 decades of research, debate, and frustrated treasure hunting, the copper scroll remains one of archaeology's most enduring enigmas, a document that seems to promise answers while withholding them perpetually. It stands alone among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only one inscribed on metal, the only one concerned with material wealth rather than spiritual matters, the only one that reads like a practical guide rather than a religious text. These unique characteristics guarantee it will continue fascinating researchers and capturing public imagination regardless of whether its treasures are ever found. The scroll represents something deeper than a simple mystery about hidden gold. It embodies the human need to believe that valuable things can be preserved against catastrophe, that knowledge carefully recorded will eventually find the audience it was intended for, and that hope can be hammered into metal and survive millennia of darkness, waiting for the light. The 3 main theories about the scroll, genuine treasure map, collection of folklore, or elaborate fiction, each have compelling arguments and serious weaknesses. The genuine treasure theory explains the use of expensive copper, accounts for the scroll's technical language and precise quantities, and makes sense of its presence among other important documents at Qumran. If temple priests or community leaders were hiding enormous wealth and needed a durable record of locations, the copper scroll is exactly what we would expect them to create. The quantities, while staggering, are not impossible for a wealthy institution like the Second Temple to have accumulated over centuries. The geographical distribution across 64 locations reflects sophisticated planning to protect assets through diversification. And the failure to find the treasures can be explained by Roman recovery, environmental changes, and the loss. Yet the genuine treasure theory struggles with the complete absence of any finds despite decades of searching. If the scroll is accurate and the treasures still exist, why has not even one small cache been discovered? Modern archaeology has thoroughly surveyed the regions mentioned in the scroll, excavated extensively at Qumran and Jerusalem, and investigated hundreds of caves and tombs in the Judean wilderness. While absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, at some point the continued failure to find anything becomes itself significant evidence. Either the treasures never existed, or they were recovered long ago, or they remain so perfectly hidden that modern technology and systematic searching cannot locate them. The first option contradicts the scroll's material expense and technical precision. The second leaves us wondering why the scroll survived if recovery was successful, and the third requires believing in hiding techniques so sophisticated that they exceed our ability to discover them even with advanced technology. The folklore theory avoids these problems by simply denying that real treasures were ever involved. Ancient Jewish communities certainly had traditions about hidden wealth, legendary accounts of riches concealed before various disasters, and waiting to be revealed in messianic times. Perhaps the copper scroll compiled such traditions, recording them on durable copper because the stories themselves were considered culturally valuable, even if the treasures were mythical. This interpretation explains why nothing has been found, there was nothing to find, and accounts for the enormous quantities that strain credibility. Legends always exaggerate, turning modest treasures into fantastic hoards. The vague geographical references make sense for folklore, which doesn't need precision because actual recovery is not the point. The stories provided hope and maintained connection to a glorious past, serving psychological and social functions more important than material recovery. But the folklore theory cannot explain the scroll's complete lack of narrative content or its bureaucratic language. Every known example of treasure folklore includes stories, explanations of how the treasure came to be hidden, who hid it, why it was necessary, and what omens or signs will mark the time for its recovery. These narrative elements are essential to folklore's function. They convey moral lessons, reinforce cultural identity, and make the stories memorable for oral transmission. The copper scroll strips all this away, leaving only locations and quantities presented with accounting precision. This is not how folklore works. Moreover, the copper investment makes no sense for preserving stories that everyone already knew from oral tradition. Legends don't need expensive preservation because they preserve themselves through retelling. The decision to use copper implies the creators believed they were recording unique information that might otherwise be lost, not widely known stories that would survive through memory. The theory that the scroll is literary fiction or an ancient thought experiment faces similar objections. While ancient writers certainly created fictional works, they did so in recognized literary forms with clear markers of their fictional nature. Parables began with, "There was a man," or similar formulaic openings. Allegorical texts included interpretive keys explaining their symbolic meaning. The copper scroll uses none of these conventions. It presents itself as a straightforward inventory, using documentary language and format that claim factual accuracy. If it is fiction that disguises itself as fact more completely than any other ancient text we know. This seems unlikely for a culture that had clear distinctions between factual records and imaginative literature. The scroll's creators would have had to invent a new genre, documentary fiction, that would not become common until 2 millennia later in modern Western literature. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these theories, incorporating elements of each while fully satisfying none. The scroll might record real hiding operations, but with quantities exaggerated either deliberately or through errors in transcription and copying. It might describe genuine locations but mixed with legendary sites, combining historical memory with traditional lore in ways that ancient creators did not clearly distinguish. It might have been created as a genuine guide, but incorporating enough deliberate obscurity to protect the information from enemies, making it useless without oral traditions or companion documents that have been lost. This hybrid interpretation acknowledges the scroll's complexity and the possibility that our modern categorical thinking, demanding that it be either true or false, real or fictional, misses nuances that ancient creators understood but did not make explicit. The reference to an explanatory scroll in the Copper Scroll's final line remains the most tantalizing aspect of the entire mystery. That single sentence, promising a duplicate copy with full explanation and measurements, suggests a comprehensive documentation system of which we have only one component. If that explanatory document could be found, everything might become clear. We would learn which cubit measurements were intended, how to identify the architectural features described, what the place names specifically referred to, and perhaps most importantly, whether the treasures were real or symbolic. The explanatory scroll would presumably have been written on parchment rather than copper, making it far more vulnerable to destruction and far less likely to survive 2,000 years. It could have been burned, rotted away, consumed by insects, or deliberately destroyed if capture seemed imminent. Or it might still exist somewhere, buried in a cave or tomb that archaeologists have not yet discovered, waiting like the Copper Scroll itself for chance or systematic searching to reveal it. The possibility that this explanatory document exists and might someday be found keeps the mystery alive and ensures continued research interest. Every new excavation in the Judean wilderness, every cave explored, every tomb opened, carries the remote possibility of recovering the scroll that would unlock the Copper Scroll's secrets. This possibility, however slim, justifies ongoing attention to the puzzle and prevents it from being dismissed as conclusively solved or permanently unsolvable. The Dead Sea Scrolls were themselves unexpected discoveries, found by accident by Bedouin shepherds rather than through systematic archaeological work. If the Copper Scroll could survive unnoticed for 2,000 years only to emerge in 1952, why couldn't its explanatory companion still be waiting in an unexplored cave? The precedent of unlikely survival and accidental discovery gives hope to researchers who continue studying the scroll and planning expeditions to search for what it describes. Yet we must also acknowledge the possibility that the mystery may never be solved, that the Copper Scroll will remain forever tantalizingly incomplete. If the treasures were recovered by Romans or others in antiquity, physical evidence is gone regardless of how much we study the text. If the explanatory scroll was destroyed, we lack the key that would make the Copper Scroll comprehensible. If the original hiding locations are now buried under meters of sediment, medieval construction, or modern buildings, they may be effectively irretrievable, even if we could identify them precisely. The scroll might be a message in a bottle that reached shore too late, after the sender's civilization had vanished, and the recipients who could understand it had all died. We can read the message but cannot fully comprehend it because we lack the cultural and linguistic context that would make it intelligible. This is both frustrating and oddly appropriate, a reminder of how much knowledge is lost when civilizations collapse and oral traditions are broken. The Copper Scroll's ultimate significance may lie not in whether its treasures are real, but in what it reveals about human responses to catastrophe. In the face of overwhelming disaster, the destruction of their holiest site, and the end of their world as they knew it, someone chose to spend precious time and valuable resources creating a record for the future. They believed, despite everything, that there would be a future, that their community or successors would survive and eventually need to recover what had been hidden. This act of preservation was fundamentally hopeful, an assertion that loss could be mitigated, that some continuity could be maintained across the chasm of destruction. Whether the treasures were real or the record accurate becomes almost secondary to that basic human gesture of reaching forward through time, trying to ensure that something of value would not be completely lost. Every treasure map is ultimately a message about mortality and survival. It says, "I cannot keep these things safe myself, so I am leaving them for you who come after." The copper scroll makes this message in the most durable form its creators could devise, acknowledging that they might not survive, but insisting that their legacy should. 2,000 years later, we have received that message, but cannot fully decode it. We know someone valued these locations and quantities enough to preserve them on copper. We know they expected future generations to search and recover. We know their world ended in fire and slaughter, that the temple fell and the community scattered. And we know that somewhere, under the hills and wadis of the Judean wilderness, there may or may not be chambers and cisterns containing gold and silver placed there in desperate hope by people whose names we will never know. The treasure, if it exists, is real, but the mystery is eternal, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps being haunted by questions we cannot answer is the truest form of connection to those ancient voices calling to us across the millennia, recorded in copper because nothing less permanent would carry their message through time's dark passage to reach us here. Now, still searching for what they hid when the world was ending, and hope was all they had left to preserve.